Hey guys. Okay. So we just wanted to film a little video. I'm Noah Airmet, cavalry member, just got back a few months ago, and we ran across this post on r/X Mormon that we just really wanted to record a little video about. It's nothing crazy, but we thought it deserved a little bit of attention. I don't think it's gonna blow up or anything. It's not gonna
Mhm.
become the next CES letter, but it got enough traction, and I thought it would be a good exercise to go through it with you guys. Um, do you want to introduce yourselves? David, Connor?
Yeah, sure. I'm also a member of the cavalry, served my mission from 2022 to August of this year. I'm at BYU Idaho right now and have been working on starting up our club here. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then my name's Connor Smith. I was actually never a member of the cavalry, but yeah, I served my mission. I've been back for about 5 years now, and yeah, just here at BYU and helping to start the apologetics club here. Whatever we end up deciding to
Yeah,
call it.
we'll figure that out. Honorary member for sure. Zach, were you still online? Were you going to comment?
Hi, I'm Zach. I probably won't comment, but I'm here.
Perfect. Okay. If there's anything you want to jump in and say at any time, feel free to interrupt. But let's just jump right into this. So what are we looking at here? So um, from what we can tell, this is an email that was sent out by probably a disaffected member in the stake organization down in Sydney, Australia. We know which stake it was, the Mortdale stake, and someone either hacked the email client or is high enough up, just like a secretary or a clerk or something, and is disaffected that they were able to get access to the stake email and just send this out to literally everyone, which is hilarious. And they sent this out under the kind of disguise of being a pilot program to expose the members of the stake more to the historical issues in the church, right? Is kind of how they introduce it on this first page, right? As you know, leaders are trying to be more transparent with some of the messiness in our history. Right there. This guy's pretty um, disingenuous with the language sometimes, kind of. You'll see a lot of the anti-Mormon buzzwords that kind of give it away throughout the entire essay, but uh, trying to be more transparent with the messiness. You've all seen the gospel topic essays and videos of President Nelson, and then he gives this fake paragraph about a pilot program, um, and then jumps into just a giant list of points against the church. Just jumps right into it. It's
Mhm.
hilarious. After there's nothing here to really set up a pilot program or say what they're actually going to be doing. It's literally just read all of these points below, rather than viewing the websites and looking into all the footnotes to get the full faithful picture. He's just kind of assuming that members are lazy about it and don't want to get into the rest of it. It's a very
Condescending.
what's the word? Yeah, condescending view. But take a deep breath and let's dive in at the deep end. Love this.
Yeah. No, I
Um,
still say that the most likely possibility is that this is somebody's teenage kid who is just trying to be rebellious and do something stupid, stole their parents' email access, borrowed their laptop, something like that, and then wrote this whole thing out. But yeah, I think that while there isn't anything really new here, nothing really shattering, I can't imagine anybody really reading this and like having their testimony broken. But at the same time, this is probably some people's first introduction to the world of apologetics. There are a lot of people who, I mean, for better or for worse, just simply aren't aware of these issues. And nothing wrong with that, but that also means that a lot of the shock value of these things is gonna, it has a potential to seriously affect some people. And so, yeah, that's why we're doing a little response here, just to quickly go through some of the responses to these critical arguments.
yeah. Okay. We're gonna try and get through it as quickly as possible. Our goal here is not to give incredibly thorough responses to each of the points they bring up. It's mostly just to um, point out that on just about every single one of these issues, there is so much faithful scholarship being done that anti-Mormons, ex-Mormons, disaffected members just do not interact with at all. And it's kind of ridiculous, and we just want to put some of that stuff out there. So, starting off with these first two are really interesting as a pair. We are not getting our own planets. This is not in our scriptures, nor is it doctrine, and we are not becoming God. I feel like these were added after the fact to kind of like soften the blow before jumping into some of the crazy Book of Abraham stuff. But
Mhm.
David, do you want to start this one off?
Or yeah, I mean, well, first off, with the planets thing, they're citing an FAQ that actually said a lot, which is true. Getting our own planet is not explicitly laid out within like our doctrines. However, becoming like God, or even more explicitly, becoming gods, is explicitly part of our doctrine and explicitly in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Mhm.
Doctrine and Covenants 132, verse 20 says, "And they shall be gods because they have no end. Therefore, they shall be from everlasting to everlasting because they continue. Then they shall be above all because all things are subject to them. They shall be gods because they have all power and the angels are subject to them." So here it is in our scriptures explicitly saying we will be gods.
And I think one of the most interesting things, and this is a common theme that we're going to see throughout the entire essay, is if you actually go and click on the footnotes, which the author kind of jokingly suggests that he doesn't want you to actually do. He's like, oh, you don't need to read through the whole sources. Just let me provide it for you. If you actually click on the footnotes here, it's very clear that what the footnotes say directly contradict what the author is actually saying. We're going to see this over and over again all night long. Um, he is saying that we do not believe that we are not becoming a god, right? This is not in our doctrine. But the footnote he links to, Church News FAQ, point number 11 here, um, very explicitly says
Do you think you can pull that
our
up on the screen?
teaching, can you see it?
Wait, is it not? Oh wait, okay, never mind. That was my problem on my end. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
So he very explicitly says our belief is the biblical belief, which is we will be heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, right? Christ being God, right?
Mhm.
So the scripture that the Church News is citing here is a very common scripture that's used to prove this idea of theosis, this idea of divinization, or as we call it, exaltation, right? The important aspect here being that this idea that we can become like God is a universal belief held by every single one of the early Christians. I'm already way over time here, so I'm not going to really get into it, but you can, this is a set of quotes compiled by our own expert on patristics in here, Christopher Davis. Um, this is as universal as it gets within early Christianity, right? There was disputes over the Trinity, over the authority of the church, over all sorts of stuff, like over Christology. Everyone agreed on deification. It's like we can go through all of these really important big names in early Christianity. Justin Martyr, one of the first big systematic theologians, Irenaeus of Lyons, right? The big anti-Gnostic who kind of the first apologist, Clement of Alexandria, who kind of really kicked off this Alexandrian tradition of the amazing metaphoric interpretations of the scripture. Tertullian, the great lawyer, right, who took his training as a lawyer and put it to apologetic use. All of these big names, it is not hard to find quotes that early Christians believed in theosis. So for us, as faithful members who, in fact, do believe that we can become like God, we don't know to what extent, what exactly that means. The church is not dogmatic about what form that's going to take. But this is a really big evidence that Joseph Smith was, in fact, restoring the primitive church, right?
Mhm.
Especially in his evangelical context. There's no Catholics around him. There's definitely no Eastern Orthodox. Everyone in Joseph Smith's time fiercely rejected this idea that you could become like God, right? So the fact that Joseph Smith is pulling this lost teaching out of original Christianity, out of thin air, and perfectly restoring this incredibly important essence of what early Christians believed is pretty incredible to us. So this is a good reason of why I stay in the church. I don't know why it's on a list of uh, evidences or arguments against the church. But anyway, that's more than enough on that. Let's jump into the next one. David, do you want to read this one?
Sure. See, it says the Book of Abraham is sadly not what Joseph claimed it was. The Gospel Topics essay on the subject states that we that have the papyrus that was translated from. The translation is 100% incorrect. Does not mention Abraham at all. The papyrus was created from thousands of years after Abraham lived. It was therefore not written by Abraham's own hand, as the introduction to the book of Abraham states.
Thanks. Okay. So these next two paragraphs are going to be Book of Abraham stuff. And this is another example, again, of the author of this Sydney email citing the Gospel Topics essay. And the Gospel Topics essay is going to directly contradict what the author says the Gospel Topics essay actually says. Um, he says here that we have the papyrus that it was translated from, and the translation is 100% incorrect. But if you go to the Gospel Topics essay on the translation of the Book of Abraham, it very clearly says only small fragments of the long papyrus scroll once in Joseph Smith's possession exist today. And the relationship between those fragments and the text we have today is largely a matter of conjecture, right? So whether or not you disagree with this theory of the relationship between the text and the papyri, the author here is being disingenuous. He's claiming to speak for the church, and he's directly contradicting what the church says, right? Um, Now we could very easily we could get very, very deep into the Book of Abraham, right? And all of the apologetic issues surrounding it. This is, as Robert Ballin has admitted, the hardest book of scripture to defend from an apologetic standpoint, right? This is the big one. There's a lot of stuff going on here that definitely deserves our attention. Guide to the Book of Abraham. Let me pull this up real quick. What we would say is we would encourage people to go and read the BYU Studies Guide to the Book of Abraham, co-authored. Yep, David and I both have physical copies. Co-authored by our own Stephen Smoot. This is incredible. It's a 300-page, just incredibly scholarly dissection of all of the issues that you could possibly imagine, anything you want to know about the Book of Abraham. And the first section here is going to talk about the coming forth of the Book of Abraham. And the relevant section specifically is going to be this one on the relationship between the Book of Abraham and the Joseph Smith papyri, right? And I'm not going to get into it. We're over time. But the point here is that there are three different theories that they lay out as possible relationships between the Book of Abraham and the modern English text and then the actual papyri. The first one being that Joseph Smith was a fraud, right? That there is no relationship, that he either thought he was translating or somehow mistakenly translated, right? The second being that the Book of Abraham is translated from papyri that we no longer have, that was burned in the Chicago fire. And they will make the argument that this theory is gaining traction as we consider more seriously the firsthand, the witness accounts, which talk at length about the very long scroll of papyri that Joseph Smith had, right? Of which we have only small fragments that survived, right? We do not have nearly anywhere near what Joseph Smith had. So this theory is gaining traction. And then the third theory being that it was a catalyst, right? If I remember correctly. So there's no relationship, but it act more as a catalyst. But anyway, definitely go read that. Let's jump back into real quick down here. This second does not mention Abraham at all. The papyrus was created thousands of years after Abraham lived, therefore was not written by Abraham's own hand. David, any thoughts on that one? Or Connor, actually, I haven't given you a chance to speak.
Zach just put something in the chat, which I think is a really good point. And it's that one time that Paul says that he wrote, one of his letters, like it was written by his own hand. But obviously, we don't actually have that original letter anymore. Every single copy of the Bible that is currently in existence says written by the hand of Paul, or some variation of it. I don't have the verse right in front of me, but obviously, none of those were actually written physically by the hand of Paul. This is just a matter of copying stuff.
Yeah, there's a really famous example in Galatians 6:11 where Paul is like, see what large letters I am using to write these, kind of making fun of his own bad handwriting. We can't see those large letters. Not a single original manuscript from Paul exists today, right? So to me, it's not inconceivable to say somewhere on this papyri that Joseph Smith is translating, it's not in our actual Book of Abraham text, but somewhere on this papyri it says, written by the hand of Abraham as an introduction. And it is, in fact, a transcription, the same way that every single copy of Paul's letters is a transcription, right? So that's not
Mhm.
an issue for us. Okay, facsimiles. This is another one where I don't want to get too deep into this. We don't have time, and there are people much smarter than us who have talked about this at length.
Mhm.
But I guess we can just read what they say. Joseph translated the characters above the figures in the facsimiles, but they are all tragically wrong, eliminating any possible claim to a missing scroll theory. Um, to put that to rest, they are actually going to point out right here. I think this is worth pointing out real quick on page 56. But there's a really good response to this, which is that uh, there's no evidence on if any of the existing Book of Abraham manuscripts is the original manuscript. With respect to the extant manuscript copies of the Book of Abraham, it's not clear who placed the hieratic characters from the Book of Breathings in the margins or when they were added. It's also not clear what the scribe was thinking when he added the characters. It's been widely assumed that they were copied at Joseph Smith's prompting during the process of the translation, but this isn't certain. We don't have any evidence to prove this. So I
Mhm.
really like this BYU Studies issue because they're so academic with this, and they kind of dissect some of these assumptions that people have had for decades about the Book of Abraham, but we're kind of just assuming a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
Jumping
Now,
into the facsimiles, sorry,
just
go
one
for
thing
it.
I want to say. Speaking from experience, Book of Abraham is complicated. There's a lot to learn. It's very, very hard to speak authoritatively on this. So if it sounds like we don't know what we're talking about, it's because we don't. We're reading people who do know what they're talking about. I recommend
Mhm.
you read those people.
And that's going to be a common theme here is that anti-Mormons rarely interact responsibly with the wealth of scholarship, all
Mhm.
305 pages of this that we have, right? They just don't. I had a debate actually at the conference center over conference weekend with Dustin, another member of the club, who
Mhm.
a guy challenged us. He was like, "Come and sit down. We're going to record a full debate." We talked for an hour about the Book of Abraham, right? And I was like, "Well, I'm not qualified to do this." We literally just read from this guy for an hour. That's all we did. And this guy was just completely out of date with everything he knew about the Book of Abraham. He had read a good amount of Hugh Nibley. He'd read a little bit of, um, I think, some older stuff from Guy, but he was completely out of date with everything that had been published in the last 20 years, right? And had not heard, he even admitted, like, oh, yeah, I didn't know that these characters had been translated. I didn't know that these were drawn in the margins here. I didn't know that Joseph Smith was personally overseeing this aspect. Things that sometimes are harder pieces of evidence to deal with. So just, yeah, be aware. There's great scholarship out there. Most people are
Mhm.
not interacting with it. Please go and read this in a peace study or something. Good stuff. Okay. Jumping into, yeah, the facsimiles themselves. Joseph Smith Papers Project shows how the facsimiles were doctored to remove some of the real Egyptian content that did not fit with the Abraham narrative. Up on the
Um,
screen.
okay, so you've got
That
first of
works.
all, this facsimile one. Couple of details that are important to note is one, this guy has his arms raised, he has his legs raised, his eyes are open, and he's wearing clothes. Those are going to be important in just a second. So here's the lion couch scene. You got a sarcophagus. The guy's already been embalmed. Sarcophagus, 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 sarcophagus. Point is, all of these guys are very clearly dead. And if you keep going through the examples of these lion couch scenes, you see that almost all of them are in sarcophaguses. I think there are two exceptions. We'll see if we find it on this list. Um, let's see. Okay, so this is one of the exceptions right here. So you notice that he is completely naked. That is important because during the embalming process, obviously, if they're taking out all of your organs, you are going to take your clothes off, or like they're going to take the clothes off of the corpse. So yeah, that's kind of important to show that this is part of an embalming process. Let's see. This one I think is another sarcophagus, but it's kind of hard to tell. Um, let's see. Let's see. Naked corpse, naked corpse. Oh wait, no, that is a sarcophagus. Sarcophagus, sarcophagus. The heck is that? I have no idea what that is. Okay, but point is, you see that all of the guys are either in a sarcophagus or they are naked. However, if you see right here, this guy has his clothes on, his arms are raised, his eyes are open. This is not a corpse on there. And that kind of blows a huge hole in any possible theory that involves this being just a normal lion couch scene. Because again, in a normal lion couch scene, that guy laying down is dead. This guy isn't. So there's clearly something going on here. And even I, as a completely uninformed layman, can see that. So hopefully you can see that too.
Yeah, pretty clear. Yeah, I think the biggest thing when we're approaching these facsimiles, because we don't want to get too deep into it, but just kind of understanding some of these assumptions about how we're interpreting them. This is one of the best parts of this entire guide is in book three, or in part three, they're going to go through the different approaches to how we interpret the facsimiles. And a lot of these are kind of unspoken assumptions here, but they lay out, just real quick, 7 different interpretive options we can take to understand the context in which we should understand these. One would be that the facsimiles were original to Abraham. We should try and understand how Egyptians in Abraham's day would have understood them. That's one way we could interpret these. But two would be that they were original to Abraham but modified over time. And then we should consider these underlying Abrahamic elements, but then compare them with how Egyptians understood these images, right? Another way we could interpret these, and this would be completely different in the conclusions that we draw about what these symbols actually mean, right? Is that the facsimiles were connected to the Book of Abraham and the Ptolemaic pyramid when the Joseph Smith papyri were created. We should try and figure out what those Egyptians would have interpreted. Or we could say that we should look in that same Ptolemaic period how an Egyptian priest who was integrating Jewish, Greek, and Mesopotamian religious practices would have understood these, right? We
Mm-hmm.
could say that we should look how Jews in this era would have understood these. We can say even that the facsimiles were never part of the Book of Abraham, but instead were completely reinterpreted by Joseph Smith to artistically depict the text that he revealed or translated, which we can do by expanding our understanding of his role as translator, right? Finally, we could say that this is a very complex one, but there is precedent for complex revelation like this in our church. Facsimiles were never part of the Book of Abraham, but Joseph Smith by revelation perceived the meaning of these figures in their ancient Egyptian context, and based on similarities, syncretized many of them to details within the context of Abraham's life. Then we should understand their ancient Egyptian context and the figures he overlays with Abrahamic detail due to perceived similarities between the concepts. We still have to understand the figures in their Egyptian context, but we don't have to assume that Joseph Smith's explanations are how the Egyptian would have strictly understood them, right? So a lot of anti-Mormons are just going to very blindly and blatantly and give this very black and white Egyptologists disagree, right? And it's so much more complex than that, right? It's not just Egyptologists disagree with Joseph Smith on how this was translated. We can't even agree in the first place on how we're supposed to interpret these, right? Who's doing the interpreting, how these should be understood, what the elements we should be looking are, anything like it, right? So yeah. Anything, David, that you want to add to facsimiles? I think that's going to be it before we move on, and then we should be able to go through the rest of this a lot faster.
Mm-hmm.
All good? Okay, let's jump on. Uh, Joseph Smith married 30 to 40 women. Footnote 24 in the plural marriage essay. Yeah, I hope this isn't a surprise to
Mm-hmm.
anyone. Actually,
Yep.
actually, I was telling David there was a sister in my mission. This poor little missionary. She was a convert, had gotten baptized like 2 years before she started her mission, and she had no idea. She totally thought that polygamy was like an anti-Mormon lie, and one of our APs had to like gently explain it to her that no, like this actually did happen, and it just rocked her world. But she's doing great. She was an amazing STL. If you present this information um, with the right context, it does not have to be the end of your testimony, is the point.
Mm-hmm.
This is a point that Dr. Garrett Dirkmaat here at BYU makes all the time, that the person who is giving you new information controls how you interpret that information, right? So if you have an anti-Mormon saying, "Did you know about this nefarious element in the history of church?" That's going to come off very differently than, your bishop mentioning this offhandedly as a cool fact he learned once, but doesn't damage his testimony in the slightest, right? Um, so yeah, anyway, 30 to 40 women. Hopefully everyone knew about that. 12 to 14 of these women were already married to other righteous men. I'm going to take issue with only one word here, and it's righteous. This is another one where the footnotes that he's citing are not on his side because the footnote the author links to here does not actually say what he wants it to say. The author is citing a footnote that refers us to Brian Hales, but the author of this Sydney email clearly has not read anything by Brian Hales because Brian Hales would take issue with the fact that all of these men are righteous. He would say that most of these, if not all of these, marriages to women that are already married are going to be sealings for eternity only. That these other men are either abusive or are neglectful because they don't want to join the church, they don't care, they're unconcerned about this incredibly important aspect of the woman's lives that they want to be sealed into this family for eternity, right? Um, so that's an important thing to keep in mind there.
Mhm.
Anything about that specific point before we move on to um, the next one, Helen Mar Kimball?
I think it is worth pointing out one specific example, just to, like we can't
Mhm.
obviously can't go into all 12, 14 women, but I think one example is worth pointing out just to point out that there is a little bit more nuance here than this letter is giving it credit for.
Yeah.
So, for example, so there's a woman named Ruth Sayers who was married, and Joseph Smith was actually really good friends with her husband. Now, he wasn't a member of the church. This guy didn't actually believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet, and he believed that his marriage with his wife would be at an end after they died. And so he told Joseph Smith, "Hey, if you want to try to marry my wife after she's dead, go for it." Joseph Smith had his full blessing, and that is according to Ruth Sayers herself. She gave testimony of this in, I want to say, in like the 1880s, 1890s, and way after it happened. But she was telling about people about how her husband had no problems with the fact that Joseph was going to be sealed to her for eternity, not for time. Obviously, they weren't together during time, but in the eternities they were sealed together, and so presumably now that they're both dead, they are married at this moment now. Um, but yeah, that's kind of something that happened. That's something that happens, and it's worth keeping in mind that there's a lot of context that we're missing here. That it's really impossible to get into in a really short rebuttal like this. But it's something that you always need to just keep in the back of your mind anytime somebody is spouting large numbers at you. Is just remember that these are individual people. Remember that you ought to look into the individual examples and look at what the historical record actually says.
And this is going to be huge with this next one of his youngest wife,
Yes.
who was 14 years old, because the 14-year-old in question was Helen Mar Kimball. And
Mhm.
the anti-Mormons don't want you to go and actually read anything that Helen Mar Kimball wrote later in her life. They don't want you to learn what Helen Mar Kimball actually thought about polygamy, because Helen Mar Kimball, towards the end of her life, would become the most ardent defender of polygamy in the early church. She was amazing. She published
Mhm.
multiple books on this, going through and defending her experience, defending Joseph Smith. Um, she she would be very angry at the elitist New York women, as she thought of them, that were trying to take her right to practice polygamy away from her, and would write books like Plural Marriage as taught by the prophet Joseph Smith, a reply to Joseph Smith, editor of the Herald, right? Her second book, Why We Practice Plural Marriage, is this argument towards these Eastern women who don't understand them, right? So
Mhm.
the anti-Mormons don't want to let Helen Mar Kimball speak for herself. They want to control
Mhm.
the narrative and say, this is what you should think about Joseph Smith marrying a 14-year-old, rather than you going and reading Helen Mar Kimball's documents, right? And teaching all of this. Helen Mar Kimball said, I heard Joseph Smith teach and explain the principle of celestial marriage. After which he said to me, if you will take this step, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation and that of your father's household and all your kindred. This promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward, right? Typically omitted from such accounts is the fact that Helen clarified she may not have understood everything correctly. And
Mhm.
obviously, like everything, Joseph Smith is going to qualify all the time that this is conditional upon obedience, right? The biggest first principle of the law and ordinance of the gospel, right? Um, but yeah, all of this is just, as Zach likes to point out, poisoning the well, right?
Mhm.
This idea, this logical fallacy of presenting negative information about a target before speaking to discredit them. The anti-Mormons are going to give you a footnote and give you a negative view of what this footnote says. But if you go in and check it, one, it very often contradicts what the author of the Sydney email is actually saying. We do actually believe that we can become gods, and the church FAQ does actually say we can become white gods. Yeah. Um, Good stuff. But yeah, Helen Mark Kimball, when anti-Mormons bring her up, they tend to shoot themselves in the foot, is what I'm getting at here. You can go and read her entire book, Why We Practice Plural Marriage. It is on the Scripture Central archive. Great read. Anything y'all
Yeah,
want
no,
to add about Helen Mark
yeah.
Kimball?
So, and I think that just to address the anti argument, normally the problem that they have isn't necessarily that she was married to Joseph. It's the problem that they had Joseph had sex with a 14-year-old. That's kind of the implication there. And the implication is that if they were married, then they had sex. And to be fair, normally that is a pretty good assumption to make. Like if two people are married, normally, yes, they do have sex, but this is kind of a special case because Latter-day Saints were kind of, I don't want to say reinventing marriage, but they were doing things with marriage at the time that didn't really fit into the norm. There were a surprising amount of eternity only sealings back then. And we don't do it anymore, but back then, the idea was that these two people basically enter into a marriage that only kicks in after both people are dead. And in that sense, it's kind of like a betrothal. And so two people who have been sealed for eternity only aren't allowed to have sex because they aren't married yet. And when you look into Helen's journal, like she kept a journal at this time. And so we know what was more or less going on in her life. And if you look through that entire journal, there's absolutely no evidence that they actually had sex. She never even mentioned a time when she and Joseph were alone together without a chaperone. There's also an instance where after the sealing, she talks about being angry at her parents for not letting her go to a dance. I mean, this was a dance with boys at it. And to make a long story short, they didn't really trust the boys, but so they didn't let her go. And Helen was mad at this, but this isn't like a dance that a married woman would want to go to, so she didn't really consider herself to be a married woman in like the traditional sense of the term back then. Anyway, the whole purpose of the sealing was to bind together the Smith and Kimball families, and
Oh yeah, and there's
that's
the Temple Lot trial as well, which is
oh yeah.
huge. In 1892, the church is desperately searching for witnesses to prove that Joseph Smith did in fact practice
Mm-hmm.
plural marriage, because they're going over this Temple Lot trial with the RLDS Church, which is um, suing over all of this, right? And so there's a whole bunch of Joseph Smith's plural wives living right there in Utah, and they did not call Helen Mar Kimball to come give testimony that she had had a full marriage with Joseph Smith. And as Brian Hales will conclude, and hopefully the author of the Sydney email is okay with us citing Brian Hales because he does it so often. If Helen Mar Kimball had been sexually involved with the prophet in their plural marriage, her exclusion from the depositions is really difficult to explain. She had written two books defending plural marriage, right? We would expect her to be the prime witness, but she could not testify to a full plural marriage with sexual relations because there probably were none. So the logical conclusion here is that
Mm-hmm.
they didn't call her up because there's not enough evidence because it probably didn't happen. Right. Okay, that's more than enough about Helen Mar Kimball. We love her. She's just so great, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, shooting themselves in the foot. Let's do a lightning round here real quick. Was intimate with his wives, possibly had 2 to 3 children with them. Possible, not likely. The footnote that he cites is going to go back to Brian Hales again, who disagrees with him. Ugo Perdigo also is cited in footnote 25, and he says it's possible, but unlikely and inconclusive.
Yeah,
Joseph Smith instituted, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, we've tested through DNA. We've done DNA testing on the descendants of Joseph Smith versus the descendants of these alleged children, and we found that they don't have a genetic link to one another. And I mean, that would obviously mean that Joseph Smith was not genetically related to these people who were supposedly his children. So far, we've never found any actual case where a supposed child of Joseph Smith, was actually related to Joseph Smith, except for the ones that he had through Emma.
Yep. Uh, Joseph Smith instigated polygamy, not God, as it was Joseph who, after reading about it in the Old Testament, asked the Lord if he could put it into practice in 1831. David, any comments here?
No, nothing to add so far. You're good to keep going.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm just
let's
gonna say
check the
bullcrap.
source on this one.
I mean,
Yeah,
it doesn't really have a source. It just like we can't actually look at the footnotes. We can guess more or less what they're linking, but the hyperlinks. I mean, you can't click on a hyperlink in a screenshot. And in this case, the hyperlink
I
is
have the
just
original
ask the
quote.
Lord. Oh, you have the
I know
original.
what
Oh,
quote
perfect.
he's I
Perfect.
know what
Perfect.
quote he's pulling from. I'm absolutely
Okay.
certain it's this one. In the forepart of the year 1832, Joseph told individuals then in the church that he had inquired of the Lord concerning the principle of plurality of wives.
Mhm.
So the author of the Sydney emails language here is disingenuous. We don't know if Joseph Smith is asking the Lord if he can practice it. We don't know that Joseph Smith here is like begging, like, please let me practice. No, he's just asking about it, probably while he's doing his translation of the Bible, which makes it much more likely that this is a question very similar to other questions like priesthood, like word of wisdom, more of a, hey, what's up with this? What do we need to be doing here, right? He received for answer that the principle of taking more wives than one is a true principle, but at the time had not yet come for it to be practiced. That was before the church was 2 years old. The Lord had his own time to do all things pertaining to his purposes, his own time for restoring all things that would have been predicted by the ancient prophets. Plural marriage was first revealed in 1831, but being forbidden to make it public or teach it as a doctrine of the gospel at that time. So it was not yet like doctrine, I guess. He confided like the law of Moses, kind of
Mhm.
applied in this time, did not apply in other times. He confided the facts to only very few of his intimate associates, probably while translating the book of Genesis, is what Joseph B. Noble recalls, right? So that's one where, yeah, again, our author of the Sydney email is playing fast and loose with the sources here. They mentioned that Joseph warned others that if they would not marry him, an angel with a drawn sword would end his life. Yeah,
That's
base.
just
If you're
straight
gonna
bummer.
come back as an angel, that's the way to come back. Pretty
It
awesome.
was a
I think the
flaming
sword was on
sword
fire.
too.
Yeah, sword was
Yeah.
on fire too. Um, this is something that Don Bradley's done so much work on. I think his interview has been uploaded to the Cavalry, or it's in the drive somewhere, or it's in the Apocrypha, of Don Bradley talking about how if we get the dates correctly of the earliest plural wives of Joseph Smith, the most compelling argument is that Joseph Smith is marrying people who were very ineligible, who would not have been made good wives, who were either in some cases already pregnant. And in early Victorian America, the last thing you do is consummate a relationship with an already pregnant woman. That was
Mhm.
hugely taboo. They thought it would damage the baby. Absolute no-no. So Don Bradley humorously makes the point, if Joseph Smith is just doing this for free sex, someone needs to give him some lessons because he's going about it in the worst way possible. He's pretty bad at it. So the idea here is Joseph Smith did not want to practice polygamy. He seems to be trying to find loopholes and ways that he can do it without actually having to break like the spirit of what he understood to be true,
Mhm.
right? Anyway, this is all funny. This is a mess. Go listen to Don Bradley's stuff. He's amazing. Great dude. I'm sure if you tag him in the group, he'd be more than happy to clarify some stuff. Moving on to some quotes from Brigham Young here.
Actually, can I point out one funny thing?
Yeah,
So I think it's really funny that this guy is pretending to be, from the first presidency or some whatever, whoever's doing this
the state
pilot program.
presidency.
Yeah, and it says Joseph Smith instigated polygamy, not God. But then it goes on to say polygamy is still our in our doctrine, as if, yeah, I just don't get like what he's doing. He's like openly contradicting himself there. Anyway, I just thought that was kind of weird.
Yeah, funny
Just shows
stuff.
that there wasn't a whole lot of thought put into this.
Yeah, it's not great. Polygamy is still in our doctrine, will be part of our lives in the eternities. Brigham Young stated that the only men who will become gods will be those who enter into polygamy. Joseph F. Smith made it clear that it was essential for the salvation and exaltation of mankind. John Taylor, in referring to Joseph Smith's revelation, stated the keys of the kingdom would be removed from those who did not practice it. President Nelson and Oakes are both currently sealed to two women and will be with both of them in the celestial kingdom. Um, I don't know, Connor, any thoughts on this? For
So
me, it's
I guess going line by line, polygamy is still in our doctrine and will be part of our lives in the eternities. That is correct. Brigham Young stated that the only men who become gods will be those who enter into polygamy. That one's not correct. So if you take a lot of people are taking this quote out of context. If you go read back about a paragraph or two, I don't have it in front of me, but if you read back a paragraph or two, it says that you must be polygamists at least in your faith. And if you read the whole thing in context, basically Brigham Young is getting angry at people who think that they can pick and choose at church doctrine, that they can remain members of the church while quietly hoping that polygamy someday goes away quietly. And he said that's wrong. No, you have to actually believe that this is a principle that comes from God. You must be polygamists, at least in your faith. He doesn't actually say that you have to personally enter into polygamy yourself. I'm not familiar with the Joseph F. Smith quote or the John Taylor quote, so I'm not going to comment on that.
I can
But
comment
yeah,
on those.
oh, perfect.
There's been a whole hullabaloo since conference about Oakes using the terminology of a temporary commandment.
Mm-hmm.
And all of r/x Mormon was in an uproar about the idea. Wait, now there's temporary commandments. What is that? That's
Always
never been
happened.
doctrine. And I've just been facepalming ever since, to put it politely, because this is like the most basic fundamental aspect of Christianity, that the law of Moses is no longer practiced, that we no longer practice any of the commandments that were given in the Old Testament because Jesus Christ overrode those commandments and gave us a new set of commandments for that dispensation, right? A lot of those commandments that Jesus Christ gave the early Christians don't really make sense in our context and in our day, like some of those cultural assumptions that they had, right? So Joseph
Mm-hmm.
Smith comes in and gives us a set of commandments that work for the 1800s. Modern prophets are able to give us a set of guidelines, commandments, all of these things that work well in our 21st century context, right? So, so the idea of a temporary doctrine, that's what the law of Moses is. It was temporary doctrine, right? I,
Mm-hmm.
polygamy was a temporary doctrine. It was at the time when we needed to raise up a nation unto the Lord. It is no longer necessary. So it's not a problem at all for me to hear that Joseph F. Smith said that it was essential for the salvation of exaltation of mankind, because I'm
Mm-hmm.
absolutely sure it was for those early saints. It was absolutely necessary. If they hadn't practiced polygamy, I would not be here. I come from, on two different lines, the second wife of some of my ancestors. So if they had not taken a second wife, I would not be here, right? The church absolutely needed that growth, that stability in those early days. Um, I value my existence. Pretty cool. So,
Can I
anything
point
you want
out
to add
one?
about that before we move on?
Yeah, so one possible other interpretation of the Joseph F. Smith quote. So one thing to remember is that Jesus Christ actually comes from a polygamous line. Like his ancestors were polygamous too. If you go back, the 12 tribes of Israel come from multiple sons born to multiple different wives. And I mean, again, I don't know what the context of the Joseph F. Smith quote was, but I mean, if polygamy hadn't been a thing, Jesus wouldn't have, then the 12 tribes of Israel wouldn't have existed, and then Jesus Christ wouldn't have been born to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, probably he would have been born some other way, but I think it's just kind of interesting to think about that. Like, if polygamy had never happened ever, and now that includes Old Testament times, then Jesus Christ wouldn't have been born the way he'd been born.
Interesting stuff. Let's jump on to DNC 132. This is a fun one. I think the best response to this issue that they're bringing up here is going to be in Sarah Allen's CES letter rebuttal. This is kind of
Mm-hmm.
pulled right from the CES letter. But the problem here is DNC 132 contains all the doctrine for practicing polygamy. Sadly, all of these rules were broken by Joseph Smith. There's exactly one rule that he's referring to, and he misinterprets it, about the wives being virgins. Only a few children came from the unions. Emma was threatened multiple times if she did not comply, which denied her any free agency. Let's go through and look at what Sarah Allen has to say. CES letter rebuttal, part 25, section F. She is so thorough, bless her heart. Um, TNC 60, 13263 states, the only purpose is to multiply and replenish the earth and bear the souls of men. Why did he marry women who were already married? Women were not virgins, which violates DNC 13261. So DNC 13263 does not state that. There were four different reasons for polygamy. One of them being for the exaltation of the saints in the eternal worlds, to fulfill the promise which is given by God the Father, to continue the work of the Father, that he may be glorified. Then verse 51 gives us another, to prove us all as he did Abraham by covenant and sacrifice. This was absolutely an Abrahamic sacrifice, right? Um, this was a huge trial for these early saints, but it tried their faith and gave them a very strong, resilient faith. And then we can talk about, as we've mentioned, the difference between marrying and sealing these women, right? They
Mm-hmm.
understood sealings so differently. than we do nowadays. And the problem is most anti-Mormons are not historians, right? They tend to have a very presentist view of these things and say how we understand sealings today is how they've always been understood. But it's not. We know very obviously that there were these adoption sealings back in the day, right?
Hmm.
Where people could be sealed by adoption to the prophet, right? Everyone wanted to be connected to these big church families, and um, different historians working with the Joseph Smith papers have actually told anecdotes of church historians in the 20th century who threw away documents of men being sealed to men because they thought they were errors. They weren't. They were just adoption
Hmm.
sealings, and they just understood sealings differently than we do now. It wasn't until I think Wilford Woodruff that the idea of lateral family-based sealings from parents to grandparents to children were really standardized, right? So that's how we do it now. That's not how it's always been done. And so Joseph didn't necessarily actually marry these women who were already married. He was sealed to them for eternity. And there's a difference because this specific group did not include sexual relations. They were not sealings for time, just eternity, right? Zina Huntington, for example, her marriage to Henry Jacobs was valid and enforced during her lifetime, right? Zina later divorced him and then married Brigham Young. She needed someone to support her, right? And then in the scriptural context, this is such an obvious one. Virgin just means someone who's morally pure,
Hmm.
right? Spiritually, morally pure. This is
And yeah,
pretty straightforward. That's not a problem for us in the slightest. Okay, let's keep going. We got to get through these faster. The Book of Mormon was translated using a rock and a hat. Did everyone here know that? I think we all knew that. I think we've
yep.
known that. Yeah. This was the same method Joseph used right before attempting to locate buried treasure for others. Just on the rock and a hat thing, real quick. The, um, anti-Mormons tend to bring this one up because they think the church lied to them, or it's a good evidence that the church is trying to hide its history. It's not. The rock and the hat has been consistently talked about throughout the entire history of the church, and we have all of the documents we need to prove that. Let me pull up. There's a great video from our friend over at Keystone, previously Saints Unscripted, David Snell, who goes through the entire timeline of all the different documents that we have talking about the seer stone. And we have so many. Throughout all the 1800s, there's tons. This was very common knowledge, right? Throughout the early 1900s, there's tons. This is very common knowledge. Throughout the later 1900s, what happens is we get a few apostles who leaned more fundamentalist-y in this area right here were not expert historians, and they misinterpreted these documents. But even during this time, the height of these represents the number of sources we have talking about this. They're consistently talking about this. I think he mentions even during this time where they weren't talked about as much, he didn't put this in the timeline, but 1974, Stanley Larson affirmed the Steerstone method in his BYU master's thesis, right? Kind of at the height of this anti-historical era, right? So this has been talked about repeatedly throughout the history of the church. There's no massive cover-up to hide church history here.
Hmm.
There's one or two prophets and apostles who were not historians and got it wrong. And they were just wrong about this.
Yep. No, and actually, can I read a really funny story? So, kind of related to looking for treasure with the Rock and the Hat. There
Hmm.
is a interview with Martin Harris in uh, August of 1859, and he gives this interview, and he tells a story about Joseph and his Rock and the Hat. And I'm going to read it right here. So he says, I was at the house of Joseph's father in Manchester, 2 miles south of Palmyra Village, and I was picking my teeth with a pin while sitting on the bars. So, like, he was sitting up in the rafters of a barn, and he was picking his teeth with this little pin. And he says, the pin caught in my teeth and dropped from my fingers into the shavings and straw. I jumped from the bars and looked for it. Joseph and Northrop Sweet also did the same. We could not find it. I then took Joseph on surprise, and I said to him, I said, take your stone. I had never seen it. I didn't know he had it with him, but he had it in his pocket. He took it and he placed it in his hat, the old white hat, and placed his face in the hat. I watched him closely to see that he did not look to one side. He reached out his hand beyond me on the right and moved a little stick, and there I saw the pin, which he picked up and gave to me. I know he did not look out of the hat until he had picked up the pin. Joseph had the stone for some time. So at least this is the same stone that Joseph supposedly used to translate the Book of Mormon. And I think it's really interesting here that Martin Harris is saying, yeah, Joseph could find things with this stone. And as for finding treasure, I think a more likely explanation is just that there wasn't any treasure to be found. I mean, who buries treasure in the middle of New York?
Yeah. So anti-Mormons tried to use this point that he didn't find any treasure to try and indict Joseph Smith for dishonesty. The much more
Or
obvious explanation is just there wasn't any treasure to be found, right?
Mhm.
He could have been religiously sincere and looking for treasure and just didn't find any. Um, or so you'll get some evangelical anti-Mormons as well who try and say, "Oh, treasure hunting's not very Christian of him. That's a witchcraft type stuff." David, I think you got this quote for us. Is that right? Yeah, do you want to read
Yeah,
that?
sure. Yeah. So this quote is from a non-Latter-day Saint anthropologist and independent researcher, Manuel Padro, and he kind of just says it in his context right here. He says, treasure hunting was explicitly a form of Christian folk religiosity as practiced in upstate New York, where Joseph Smith was, and New England. For many rural Yankees, treasure seeking was a materialistic extension of their faith. And that's from a certain journal that he wrote in, and it was cited in a book. And I think essentially what is coming away from here is it is weird to us because we are 21st century Western people and we're looking at this from our worldview, but we have to extend looking at a historical people a certain amount of grace because they view the world much differently than we do. For example, the ancient Israelites believed the earth is flat, right? That's reflected in the biblical texts. There's a lot of really what we consider strange practices in the Bible. For example, they talk with like the dead and things like that. They use all kinds of sort of like holy artifacts and objects and things like that, which seems very unusual to us. But if you look at it from their point of view, from their eyes, it's completely just an expression of their Christianity. And so we need to extend that kind of worldview to Joseph Smith and try to think like someone in rural upstate New York would think.
hmm Yeah, I mean, this is the time of the Second Great Awakening. These people are as God-fearing as they come. They read the same Bible that you did. They didn't think that this was sorcery. They just thought that this was how the world works, and yeah, they didn't see anything wrong with it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think one thing too to point out is this also the very last like sentence of this says that Joseph Smith was in trouble with the law for this fraudulent practice. And that is like a really ambiguous statement. Um, First, yes, Joseph Smith was charged for a lot of things over his lifetime. Specifically for this, he was never found guilty for any of these things. I could not find any single instance where a court found him guilty for fraudulent practices. And so, of course, we have to assume that someone is innocent until proven guilty. And Joseph Smith was never proven guilty and never convicted in court. So,
Yep. Great stuff. Okay. Yeah, there's an essay from Richard Bushman that I pulled up here on some of the great stuff about treasure digging. Next up, Adam Clark's commentary. Joseph Smith, allegedly, according to the Sydney email author, plagiarized the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible from Adam Clark's commentary on the Bible. Um, I have right here an article written by, pull it up there, Kent Jackson. So this is a pretty common anti-Mormon claim here, or even from LDS scholars who just aren't aware of the latest scholarship. I was not until recently, actually, because Thomas Wayment is amazing, the guy who wrote the original article trying to establish a connection between the Clark commentary and the Joseph Smith translation. But
hmm
much more recently, we have Kent P. Jackson, who wrote a pretty definitive rebuttal of Thomas Wayman's original article. I don't see anyone, I don't know anyone within the scholarly community here at BYU. I talk to a lot of the professors just online, interacting with a lot of these people. I don't know anyone who still holds to the theory that there's a high level of correspondence between Clark's commentary and the Joseph Smith translation. Kent P. Jackson pretty solidly put this theory to rest, going
You're
through every single instance that Thomas Wayment alleged as a connection and showing how, in some cases, Wayment was just flat out wrong. We can go through maybe a few examples here. I like this one in 1 Corinthians 15:26. The King James Version here says, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death," right? The italics words being the ones the translators weren't sure about. And then the Joseph Smith translation changes that to, "The last enemy, death, shall be destroyed." So Kent lets us know. Clark provides a paragraph in which he says that the general resurrection will put an end to death, but nowhere in his commentary does he talk about the wording of the verse. Wayman's statement that Joseph Smith's revision is the exact word order suggested by Clark is simply not true. It's not there. Clark does not suggest a word order anywhere. There's a better explanation for how the prophet came to revise this verse. The short sentence has two italicized words in it, not mentioned by Wayman's, and we know that the prophet did not like these italicized words. Removing them yields the last enemy shall be destroyed, death. But the prophet's rewording is a predictable fix for this verse that is consistent with how he revised many other verses. Same thing in 1 Corinthians 15:52. Clark gives a 200-word commentary on "at the last trump," this last part of this phrase, drawing from rabbinic tradition to explain it. Wayman's statement that Joseph Smith's revision follows a clarification first proposed by Clark is again untrue. Clark makes no proposal anywhere in this verse. And the words from Clark that Wayman quotes have to do with a later clause in the verse that Joseph Smith did not revise. The prophet removed the word last, but it is evident that Clark did not want it removed because he repeats it in his commentary, this phrase "at the last trump." That Joseph Smith removed it shows there is no relationship between his revision and Clark. Or in Colossians 2:20 through 22, this will be the last one real quick. In this passage, Joseph Smith moves the second half of verse 22 to the end of verse 20. The Campbell and the Rodolphus Dickinson translations reorder the verses in the same way. Clark writes, these words should follow the 20th verse, but without rearranging the words, the translation of Neelan and Palfrey insert extra words in an attempt to make better sense of the existing text. Many people in Joseph Smith's generation, the point here, observed that this text was awkward, but if the prophet had done as Clark advised, it would still be very awkward, and it doesn't look much like how he actually revised it, right?
Mhm.
So this is just an indicative sample. You can see over here on the right. This is a very long article because Ken P. Jackson goes through every single proposed convergence, and he just pretty definitively demonstrates this is outdated. Um, there is no convergence here. And from what I know, even Thomas Wayman, great guy, incredibly smart. I have his translation of the New Testament here on my shelf. Amazing dude. But even he does not support this theory anymore, from what I know, because after Kent P. Jackson went through it. So this is another case where it's just like the anti-Mormons are just not familiar with the scholarship on these topics. They're
Mhm.
not actually up to date with all of the resources being published. And most of what's being published is being published by faithful members, right? The people who know these issues best tend to be faithful, both Thomas Wayman and Kent P. Jackson, right? So they're trying to use our own scholarship against us, and it just doesn't work out for them. Any
Mm.
other thoughts on the Clark commentary?
Yeah, you covered it.
Sweet. Multiple versions of the first vision. David, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, pretty simple. Were there multiple versions of the first vision? Yes. Why? Well, because Joseph Smith delivered it at different times to different audiences with different purposes and rhetorical goals. And of course, since these are being delivered over time, one would expect differences or certain things to be emphasized, other things to be de-emphasized. But one thing that I did find very fascinating is, and I think this applies to basically everything from, the ancient world as in before the printing press, and especially even now as us humans, as we share our experiences over time, that we just would not expect all of these to be like the same. All of these things have like a completely smooth, no contradictions, no problems, no errors or anything, because they're delivered over time. And there's actually one non-LDS scholar, a PhD in American religion. Um, his name is Stephen Plothero. He has a really good quote, and he says this. He says, "Critics of Mormonism have delighted in the discrepancies between the canonical accounts and earlier renditions, especially one written in Smith's own hand in 1832. For example, in the 1832 vision, Jesus appears to Smith alone and does all the talking himself, Such complaints, however, are much ado about relatively nothing. Any good lawyer or historian would expect to find contradictions or competing narratives written down years apart and decades after the event. And despite the contradictions, key elements abide. In each case, Jesus appears to Joseph Smith in a vision. In each case, Smith is blessed with revelation, and in each case, God tells him to remain aloof from all of the Christian denominations as something better is in store. And so I think really this is just not a problem. And if you are concerned or want to know more about the specific discrepancies, I recommend checking out Stephen Harper's book, Joseph Smith's First Visions. He goes over every single one of them and all of the differences and talks about it. And so, yeah, read it up.
Great stuff. And remind me that guy's credentials.
Yeah, he has a PhD in American religious history. And again, he's also a non-Latter-day Saint too. So,
Yeah, I mean, this guy knows how to analyze historical documents better than anyone on r/x Mormon. Okay, another interesting thing here. They get a little bit into the Journal of Discourses, trying to buff the amount of hyperlinks that they have in here, going through the differences. But even non-LDS historians are going to agree this is kind of a nothing burger. The key elements here are the same.
Mhm.
And yeah, there's just so much LDS scholarship on this. Stephen C. Harper's amazing book, being one of the best. Next up, there are multiple statements from the three witnesses where they admit they only saw the plates in their imaginations, not with their physical eyes. Um, this is an interesting one here. I do appreciate actually that the author of this letter distinguishes and makes it clear that this is just the three witnesses, right? Because a lot of anti-Mormons, what you run into a lot online is people saying, "Oh, one of the witnesses said spiritualized, therefore I'm going to throw out all of the testimonies of all of the witnesses, completely ignoring the massive distinction between the experiences of the three witnesses and the eight witnesses, right? The three
Mhm.
witnesses had a spiritual revelatory experience. They saw an angel, right? That is a very spiritual type of thing going
Mhm.
on. And it's the eight witnesses had a very mundane, physical, tactile experience, no revelations, no angels appearing, no visions, no
Nothing that somebody could say
heavenly
was a
choruses.
hallucination or something like that.
Right. It's a
Or
very worldly, physical experience going on,
yeah,
right?
he literally just handed it to him.
So the eight witnesses here are a lot harder to impeach, actually. And I think it's very intentional that we have these spiritual witnesses and these physical witnesses that kind of go hand in hand and complement each other, right? One group to confirm the reality of the plates, the other to confirm the reality of the fact that these are inspired, right? That this actually comes from God. But let's
Mhm.
talk about where they admit they only saw their plates in their imaginations. Um, Again, we can go to the gospel topics essay here. That's not what the gospel topics essay says in the slightest. Our Sydney email author is playing fast and loose with the sources here. They do not say they saw it only in their imaginations. There's exactly one statement from it's Martin Harris, correct, saying that he saw it with his spiritual eyes, is the
Mhm.
phrase that he uses.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I feel like a
and
lot of people give Martin Harris kind of a bad rap. Like, you remember that story I just told a second ago? He was testing
mhm,
Joseph. This was explicitly a test. He was asking him, "Hey, can you actually find stuff with your rock and a hat?" And he did. And again, when Martin Harris was a remarkably skeptical guy, like he took the characters document, he took copied down characters from the gold plates, and he went out and he tried to find the best authority that he could find, Charles Anthony. And he asked him, and apparently after that, he felt, good enough about it to go ahead and mortgage his farm. Now, this guy is not like some idiot who is gonna get conned. He is deeply skeptical of Joseph Smith, and he tests him on multiple times. Like actually, that same Joel Tiffany article, the same one that I quoted a second ago with that story about the Rock and the Hat. He goes on to talk about what his reaction was the first time that he heard about Joseph getting the golden plates. And so what he does is the day after Joseph brings home the golden plates, he goes and he finds that Joseph Smith isn't home at the Smith's house. And apparently, so what he does is he goes and he talks to each member of the Smith family individually. so that he gets their stories straight from them and he checks to see if those stories matched up with each other. And they did. And that is a remarkably skeptical thing to do. I mean, like, if you think about the most hardened skeptic, what they would do in this situation, if they had a time machine, they could go back in time. Probably what they would want to do is they would probably want to go through and they'd want to interview each member of the Smith family and ask them, hey, did things happen the way that Joseph said? And yeah, I mean, Martin Harris is doing exactly that. I mean, he is doing everything right from a skeptical perspective. And I think that the fact that people portray him as some kind of gullible moron, like I'm thinking like the South Park episode, for example, the fact that they show him as some kind of gullible moron who gets fooled by anybody who says that they saw God, I think that that is just, I don't know, really doing him dirty. I really like Martin Harris. And I think that people just don't do him justice anymore.
Yeah, and speaking
Yeah.
of Martin Harris too, there's one of this really amazing statement from him in 1853 when he's talking with David Dilly. Um, and this is what it says. He says, "Gentlemen," holding out his hand, "do you see that
Mm-hmm.
hand? Are you sure you see it? Or are your eyes playing trick on you or something? No? Well, as sure as you see my hand, so sure did I see the angels and the plates. I don't know how that can get any clearer than that. And I'm sure this
Mm-hmm.
writer of this email is completely not aware of that, or just is aware of it and is just trying to trick you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's an amazing statement also from about spiritual eyes later. David Whitmer said in 1886, because word is reaching David Whitmer about Martin Harris saying, "Oh, it was just with spiritual eyes, right?" David Whitmer says in 1886, "I have been asked if we saw those things with our natural eyes. Of course they were our natural eyes. There is no doubt that our eyes were prepared for the sight, but it was our natural eyes nevertheless," right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the confusion here can actually be resolved by trying to understand what did spiritual eyes mean to 19th century readers, right? And Neil Rappley, our own amazing Neil Rappley, has an amazing essay on this in a book that he convinced me to buy at Fair Conference, um, going through and analyzing how was this phrase used in the 19th century? What did this mean to them, right? And he's going to go through and point out that the idiom for spiritual sight actually has a really broad range of meaning. The expression eye of faith was commonly used to merely express the concept of faith with no visionary experience intended. Thus, one commentator wrote about the eye of faith looking unto Jesus for life, peace, and every blessing and sanctity thereof, without conveying any notion of literally seeing Christ in vision or otherwise. The expression spiritual eyes was used to mean being perceptive to the beauty and divine truth, or to speak about a vivid reminiscence. After centuries of thinking about the inner eye, I'm summarizing here. Quote, historian Susan Juster notes that the effort to distinguish bodily from divine sensations and images had grown into a sophisticated intellectual project by the late 18th century. Dreams, inner visions, and more tangible sensations in which the believer could see, hear, and sometimes touch the spiritual messenger were all carefully delineated, contrary to what naturalistic thinkers of the present day might assume. However, it was not the more palpable visions that were under greatest suspicion of not being divine, but pathological in some sense. In general, visions should be seen, not felt or heard in any physical way, and seen by the eye of faith, this quote again, alone. In the 19th century American landscape, the divine's inexplicable and immaterial nature ruled out the possibility of literal visions. To those who claim to experience revelation by their natural senses, they were subject to being medicalized as mad, deluded, insane, or otherwise considered mentally ill. So this is just kind of to point out that the way they use this phrase is very different from how we understand it today, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of assumptions going into this. And there's an entire great video by David Snell on this as well about what all of this means. But yeah, Susan Juster published this all in her book, Doomsayers, Anglo-American Prophecy in the Age of Revolution, with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2003. So these are non-LDS historians again saying we need to be much more careful in assuming that spiritualize, as this author here does, just assumes imagination, because it doesn't, right? There's a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot of context going into this, a whole lot of interpretation. And most anti-Mormons aren't reading publications from the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2003, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're just not going to find that level of historical analysis from r/x Mormon on a lot of these issues. But yeah, well, there's great resources on this. For David Snell, I think has done an incredible job of making a lot of the research done by Stephen C. Harper very public. He has Keystone Saints Unscripted videos going through each of the witnesses and just showing the massive amount of evidence we have going over them. But we've spent way too long on this tiny 2-line section. This is just another one where, like theosis, this is an absolute win for the church.
Yeah.
The witnesses are really hard to get all around, so it's one that we like talking about. It's possible that Oliver Cowdery denied his
Hold
testimony
on.
of the
Sorry,
book of...
one thing.
Yeah, sorry, one more thing about the witnesses.
So I think that we did actually skip a point.
Oh no.
Yeah,
Which one did I skip?
so it's multiple prophets and apostles have stated in the Journal
Oh
of
yeah, I
Discord
just was.
that it was only an angel that visited Joseph that day. Luckily, this one is really, really easy. So could you pull up the Webster's 1828 dictionary and for the word angel?
Oh, sure. On keyboard. I think we resolved most of this one just in saying that there are, the fact that there are minor differences does not mean that
Mhm.
there are necessarily
Yeah,
contradictions. So
no.
we're not worried if one mentions an angel and one mentions only the Father or only the Son
Mhm.
appearing. But here's 1828's angel.
Yep. So look at definition number 4. And it
Christ.
says, yeah, exactly.
Fascinating.
So Christ, as per the 1828 dictionary, this is how they were speaking back then. Christ is technically an angel, and he uses Revelation 10:1 as proof of that. Now, would we call Jesus an angel today? Probably not. But I mean, technically, yeah, sure. I mean, I have no problem with the idea of them saying that an angel visited Joseph Smith at the first vision, especially when that angel was Jesus Christ. That's kind of the whole point of the first vision. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. That I feel like we can probably move on
No,
without
that's a great
going
addition.
too much
That's
more.
a great addition. Thanks for that. It's
Mhm.
possible, he mentions, that Oliver Cowdery denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon. This is only a secondhand source, though, he admits. He's wrong. This isn't a secondhand source. He doesn't know what a secondhand source actually means.
Yeah.
But let's pull up the source that he's referring to. It's this poem that was published in the Times and Seasons in July 15th, 1841 by Joel H. Johnson. Connor, did you look into who that is?
I
Couldn't find much. No worries.
I couldn't find much of the article that I was looking at, but I didn't look too deeply. So
I don't think it matters too much.
yeah.
He was not an important figure within the early church. I don't think he had any special access to Joseph Smith or anything going on here. But anyway, this is just a poem of him affirming his faith, rejoicing in the glorious gospel sound, amazed with wonder. Even if fools throw their testimonies away, even if um, the Jews killed the Savior, even if they could prove that Christ wasn't the Lord because Peter cursed and swore, what if Oliver denied his testimony in the Book of Mormon or proved that Joseph Smith was false because apostates say it is? So none of this would um, affect his testimony, and he would say it's all a scheme. He
Mhm.
is saying all of this is kind of ridiculous. So this is not a secondhand source. This is not someone who is overhearing Oliver Cowdery or a friend of Oliver Cowdery, which would make it a secondhand source, saying that he denied his testimony. This is a lot of theorizing going on here. What if, what if the Book of Mormon was proven false? What if Joseph was proven false? I would still rejoice in the gospel, right? Even if that could happen. So that's, yeah, not what
Yeah.
the author wants it to say again. But let's move on real quick. DNC 132, or we're way past that. We're on Oliver Cowdery denied his testimony.
Nephi Moroni.
Nephi Moroni, this is another one this is one of those where I'm like, how in the world did this make it into the letter? Because this is such a silly issue, right?
Yeah.
There's another amazing video. I keep referencing his videos just because they are so beautiful. The
Mhm. No, he's got amazing
cinematography
visual
here
aids. Like seriously
is
amazing visual aids. Love that guy.
incredibly compelling visually. But David Snell has a video responding to a creator saying that, let's see if we can pull up
It was Nephi
where
and
she
not
says it.
Moroni who visited Joseph and directed him to locate the golden plates. And then, according to Times and Seasons, Volume 3, 753, and then Millennial
This is her
Star
claim.
183. Yep, this is
This
the
is
claim.
her
Yep.
claim is that in every early LDS publication, they use the name Nephi, not Moroni, for the angel that visited Joseph Smith, right? And David is going to go through and definitively show the earliest records actually completely contradict. She is demonstrably wrong about this. The earliest sources, all of them, every source from the almost every source from the 1830s says Moroni. The 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants calls the angel Moroni. In 1835, there's a letter from Oliver Cowdery published in the Messenger and Advocate where Oliver Cowdery correctly identifies the angel as Moroni. In 1838, there's a Q&A with Joseph Smith published in the Elder's Journal where he correctly identifies the angel as Moroni. These are all the earliest references we have. And in 1839, there's a discourse from Joseph Smith recorded by Willard Richards. Snell's going to go through all of these. And the first occurrence of Nephi is in 1839 in the earliest manuscript of Joseph Smith history. It's written in first person, but it's not. Joseph is just overseeing the project, but James Mullahand wrote it. And there's an asterisk. I wonder if I can happen to find this, um, the picture of it here. Yeah, it's this one. There's an asterisk um, from Albert Carrington, 1871, assigned by the historian's office to look into this discrepancy where it says Nephi, he puts an asterisk and writes Moroni. The footnote at the bottom says it's a clerical error, evidently a clerical error. 50 pages later in the same history of the church, Mullahan quotes from D&C 52 and correctly identifies the angel as Moroni. So this is not the church changing the story. This is not anyone hiding up the earliest editions. This is a clear and obvious clerical error, and we can go and show that every document after this that incorrectly calls him Nephi traces back and directly cites this edition of the Joseph Smith history, right? The history of the church.
I'm pretty
The
sure he just reprinted
1842
the article.
yeah, the 1842 Times and Seasons article that critics mentioned is just the printed version of this 1839 history, right? They all cite back, and Snell is going to show this that we just have such a good paper trail here. Like it's so obvious what happened. There was a clerical error that it's really surprising that this issue somehow made it onto a list of what this guy thought were like the biggest problems, the biggest um, issues with the church. I don't quite understand it, but.
Mhm.
Yeah, hopefully we can just keep putting that one to rest. This is not a good complaint against the church. Anyone want to add anything to that?
Not really.
Okay, next one. Joseph was not actually illiterate in 1830.
That one claimed he was.
I don't know who's claiming that he was. I mean, the talking line that I've always heard is that he had the education of a fifth grader, right? And that's
Mhm.
disputed. What exactly does a fifth grade education look like in his day? It varies, but I don't know anyone who's claiming that he's illiterate. I don't know if this Ensign article is perhaps claiming that he was illiterate, and then the next one over is saying that he was not. But I assume all three of these are actually saying that he was, in fact, could write a little bit. I think we all knew he could write a little bit. Emma Smith is saying
Mhm.
he could not put together a well-worded letter, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what this one is doing here, honestly. I'm very confused about that one. I don't know who's making this claim. He used to give amusing recitals to his family about the ancient inhabitants of the land before he received the golden plates. Anyone got any comments on that? I've got some thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I got this one. So, this is referencing a quote from Lucy Mack Smith's
Yeah.
biography of Joseph. This is his mother, and specifically, it's referring to where it says during our evening conversations, Joseph would occasionally give us some of the most amusing recitals that could be imagined. He would describe the ancient inhabitants of this continent, their dress, mode of traveling, and the animals upon which they rode, their cities, their buildings, with every particular, their mode of warfare, and also their religious worship. This he would do with as much ease, seemingly as if he had spent his whole life with them. So that's the part that people usually quote. The part that they don't quote is right at the very beginning, like probably about a paragraph or two beforehand. It says, from this time forth, after the initial visits from Moroni, Joseph continued to receive revelations from the Lord, and we continued to get the children together every evening for the purpose of listening while he gave us a relation of the same. These recitals were not him telling stories, they weren't anything like that. He was telling them, what he heard from Moroni. After he received instructions from the Lord, and apparently Moroni was giving him a tour of ancient America, or at least something along those lines. But yeah, Joseph would share those kinds of details that he got, and I think that's really interesting. But it's not what they think they're saying it is. And I think that it's really important to read this quote in its original context because otherwise it's really easy to take this little bit out of context and completely skew its meaning.
Perfect. Next one, Joseph Smith substantially changed the wording of an earlier revelation, inserting multiple verses that contained the priesthood restoration. None of it was in the original Book of Commandments revelation. I don't know how anyone who has been exposed to the church's idea of ongoing line upon line revelation thinks this is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is what the revelatory process looks like. Joseph Smith adds to all sorts of things. He uh, changes and edits the Book of Mormon. That's one that they don't even mention in this one. All of the grammatical changes that Joseph Smith makes. Zach, did you want to say something?
Oh, I actually had something about the last topic, but if we
Oh,
moved on,
sorry.
that's
Do you want to add it in real quick?
fine. Sure, I guess. Um, I guess I should just mention I found those that claim that like, oh, Lucy Mack Smith said this thing. I found it kind of concerning at first, and then I actually put on my critical thinking hat. I was like, why the heck is she still a member of the church then? Like, why does she? Like, why would you blatantly say, oh, he's so imaginative. He's always making up these stories, and then just not put two and two together. A very similar thought comes along when people claim, oh, uh, Joseph Smith Sr., Joseph's father, he had this vision of the tree of life, and that's where Joseph Smith stole it from. It's like, okay, well then again, why does no one put two and two together? Um, I don't know. That's just
Mhm.
kind of my 2 cents. I don't know.
No, yeah, that's the
Mm-hmm.
irony of anti-Mormons citing faithful members and then taking them out of context
Yeah.
and saying, look, this disproves the church. Okay, if this
Oh,
disproves the church, why is the person you're citing still a member of the church? Why do they still believe? Right?
yeah,
Because Lucy
very
Mack
similar
Smith,
to what's. Oh,
yeah, go for it.
sorry. So I was just saying another example that's actually very similar to this whole letter is people citing the gospel topics essays, usually the Book of Abraham translation, where it says the church admits that these, where was it, whatever they just say it admits blank. Then it's like, okay, well then why is the church still around? Like if this is so damning, this is such damning evidence. Again, why is the church doing all this?
Yeah. Again, like I said, Dr. Dirkmaat makes this point all the time. Whoever presents the evidence to you, presents the historical data, controls how you interpret it and what you think about it. And so all of these church historians, Brian Hales, Ugo Perdigo, everyone that this guy's citing, they're actually faithful members, you know. Don Bradley came back to the church after doing all of his polygamy research with Brian Hales. And so it's really weird that they think that by getting a little bit of a surprise factor and presenting just little tidbits of this information, they can then scare members who didn't previously know about it, unlike Brian Hales, into thinking that this actually disproves the church. Because if you present the information, you control how they interpret it. It's, I don't know. It's like, I can't come up with a good
Yeah,
analogy, but like using our own weapons against us, you know, and it doesn't really work.
yeah, this might have been mentioned before. I don't exactly recall, but I think a very important um, thing. I think the two biggest fallacies of this letter are one, the gish gallop, but then also the poisoning the
Mm.
well, which is just like Noah said. They give a little blurb at the beginning, and then they give the link, so that if you open the link, you kind of are reading it through the lens, this antagonistic lens that they've given you. But I think another worry that I have that I think is a good skill to learn in apologetics in general is that just don't take people's word for it, because these people are like confident. They're like, hey, read, like, here's these sources right here. It says, but like, here's what it is. And if you just take their word for it, you're actually never going to know that the sources say the exact opposite. I know, not Jeremy Runnels, Jim Bennett did something very similar in his letter, which I found amusing, even though I think Sarah Adams is much more thorough. Um, Jim Bennett's is pretty funny, and he'd often find links where it says you can find out more on this link, and then just below comment from Joe Bennett saying this link doesn't work.
Yeah.
And like you would never know that though if you never actually opened it.
Yeah, no. It's great stuff. And um kind of tying this into the next one here. Joseph accidentally translated Matthew chapter 26 twice, 3 months apart for the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. Sadly, tragically, really, there are no similarities between each attempt, any links to each of them. And again, I don't understand how this is a problem unless you come at this from the presupposition of inerrancy and prophetic infallibility, right? There's this famous saying in the church that, um, Mormons say that the prophet's not infallible, but nobody actually believes it. Catholics say that the Pope is infallible, but nobody actually believes it, right? They're always apologizing for what the Pope has done in the past, and we're always like, no, I don't care if the prophet got it wrong. It's like it actually does not affect me. But there's this other great quote just in respect to that one from Brigham Young. Um, this is one of my favorites ever that kind of helps us understand how Brigham Young and Joseph Smith really thought about revelation, translation, prophetic fallibility, all of these things. Brigham Young supposed that there had not yet been a perfect revelation given, because we cannot understand it. We receive a little here and a little there. He should not be stumbled, Brigham Young. If the prophet should translate the Bible 40,000 times over, and yet it should be different in some places every time, because when God speaks, he always speaks according to the capacity of the people. Gorgeous banger, mic drop, right? Brigham Young, not remotely fazed by the fact that Matthew chapter 26 was translated twice and it was different both times. Any additions? I think we can move through these pretty fast.
Yeah, no, that's it.
In the April 1990 General Conference, President Nelson first discussed the use of the term Mormon. Nelson wanted to have the full name be used instead. In October 1990, President Hinckley appeared to disagree, stating that Mormon meant more good and we should be proud to use the name. What he doesn't mention here is that Hinckley also kind of said it would be nice to use the full name of the church, but it's just from a PR perspective, we just can't. It would be too hard, right?
So can I actually read the exact quote here?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So this is from President Hinckley's speech. He says, 6 months ago in our conference, Elder Russell M. Nelson delivered an excellent address on the correct name of the church. He quoted the words of the Lord himself, "Thus shall my church be called in the last days, even the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." He then went on to discourse on the various elements of that name. I commend you to a rereading of that talk. And then I'm going to skip forward a little bit. He says that I suppose that regardless of our efforts, we may never convert the world to general use of the full and correct name of the church. Because of the shortness of the word Mormon and the ease of which it is spoken and written, they will continue to call us the Mormons, the Mormon Church, and so forth. And yeah, basically his point going on is just kind of try to be good examples, try to be good people, try to be good members of your community, so that people think of Mormons as these strong, good, faithful members of the community. And but his entire point is that, yeah, I suppose that regardless of efforts, we may never convert the world to general use of the full and correct name of the church. He's not wrong. We are no closer to getting people to use the full correct name of the church than we were when Russell M. Nelson made this official all the way back
1990.
in conference. I'm just saying, like, technically, both the prophets are right. Yes, we should use the full name of the church, but realistically, the rest of the world isn't. So yeah, I mean, yeah,
Yeah, I don't like I think what the author of the Sydney email is trying to do here is to create some kind of contradiction and
exactly.
say that, oh, Nelson and Monson disagreed with each other, even though, as you just pointed out, anyone who actually goes and reads the article is going to see that President Hinckley spoke very highly of President Nelson's address, that it's an excellent
Exactly.
address. You should go reread it, you know. But
Yeah.
he's banking on people not actually checking the footnotes. It's poisoning the well. Um,
Yeah.
but also, like, why are we surprised to learn that the prophets disagreed? We should not be surprised, and in fact, the prophets have told us many times we disagree. I love this quote from President Eyring here. Research and discussion, even with strongly competing views, this is Spackman, but and we'll get to Eyring, is part of the studying out in your mind that precedes revelation. That's a process among the church leaders, illustrated by this really interesting statement from Eyring. Eyring says, when I first came as the president of Rick's College, I attended my first meeting that I'd ever been in, watching the general authorities of the church, the first presidency and others running a meeting. I had been studying, President Eyring, for the 10 years I was a professor at Stanford, how you make decisions in meetings and groups. That was his PhD, right? I got a
Mhm.
chance. Here's my chance to see the way the Lord's servants do it, of which I am now one. I looked at it, this meeting, with my Harvard and Stanford eyes and thought, this is the strangest conversation I've ever heard. I mean, here are the prophets of God, and they're disagreeing in an openness that I have never seen in business. In business, you're careful when you're with the bosses, you know. Here they were just, and I watched this process of them disagreeing, and I thought, good heavens, I thought all revelation would come to them all, and they'd all see things the same way in some sort of, it was more open than anything I had ever seen in all of the groups I had ever studied in business. I was dumbfounded. But after a while, the conversation cycled around and they began to agree. And I saw the most incredible thing. Here are these very strong, very bright people, all with different opinions. Suddenly, the opinions began to just line up. And I thought, I've seen a miracle. I've seen unity come out of this wonderful, open kind of exchange that I'd never seen in all my studies of government or business or anywhere else.
Mhm.
So, um, I'm trying so hard. I've been trying so hard for the past hour not to call the author of this email a lazy learner because I know that anti-Mormons are really touchy about that. Um, but if we understand better how the revelatory process works, 95% of these issues go away.
I think there's no
And
need to call him a lazy learner because he doesn't look like he's learning much. I think it's fair to just call whoever wrote this just lazy, and that's just a objective, observation based
yeah,
off of how much thought was clearly put into this letter.
not much.
Yeah.
It's disappointing that issues as trivial as this, the idea that Monson and Nelson can disagree,
Hmm.
being apparently detrimental to someone's testimony.
Yeah.
And it just comes from these presuppositions, the assumptions, right? I think Spackman is the one who says all the time, at some point we need to stop pulling people out of the water, and doing this apologetics, and we need to go upstream and find out what's causing people to fall in, right? And most of it is these erroneous assumptions about how the revelatory process works. Anyone else want to add anything about Hinckley and Nelson? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
I'm good.
Okay. Next up, the exaltation and priesthood ban that was imposed upon some of our members for 126 years was sadly because of the personal racist beliefs of past prophets of our church. No disagreements here.
Yep.
The ban was not because of dark-colored skin. The ban was not because dark-colored skin is an indication of divine disfavor or because of any actions in the pre-existence. Absolutely agree. Although Brigham Young stated that black people will not get the priesthood until the millennium after every white man's had opportunity, he was just speaking as a man.
Okay. So he did not say it would not be until the millennium. He said that. Okay, so this is my personal interpretation of what Brigham Young was trying to get across. That basically the African race would be the last one offered the opportunity to have the priesthood. And I think that the 1970s are a pretty decent ballpark guess for about the time that became a global church as opposed to an American church.
Mhm.
I think again I haven't done a whole lot of research in this. I think it's reasonable to think that Brigham Young was right that every race was given the opportunity to have it before the African race, and I for better that and no, that wasn't a good thing. Yes, it was due to racism, but I think it is worth
Yes,
pointing out that no, Brigham Young was not necessarily speaking as a man. I think that he was correct technically.
I lost you there a little bit, but
Oh,
I would like to talk about the other
you
half
good?
of his
Did I drop out?
statements. No, no, you. I heard it. I just didn't quite understand.
Oh,
But
okay.
I wanted to make a point. I mean, I think
Yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
Brigham
Go
Young
ahead.
was just he was racist, and that was wrong, and everything about it
Mhm.
was wrong, and there was nothing inspired in that. But the point I wanted to make is this point Spackman makes about speaking as a man, this phrase that we use that comes from Joseph Smith, but is often misinterpreted, right? Joseph Smith being reported to have said that a prophet was a prophet only when he was acting as such, right? And otherwise, if he's just speaking as a man, um, that's not remotely inspired. And this is a really black and white way of looking at the world that doesn't map very well onto reality.
Hmm.
Black and white dichotomies like this are useful for explaining things to younger, maybe primary age kids, for helping us understand the basic concepts. But as you grow up and evolve and have more complex understandings of the world, you should grow out of that. And um, the problem here is that acting as a man distinction contributes little to our understanding of the nature of prophethood or revelation when the man is acting as a prophet. It perpetuates this false idea that we can easily identify their human aspects because they are less than perfect ones, but that when on, the prophetic message should be ideal, complete, divine, and timeless. This idea of inerrancy, which has no place in the LDS tradition. There is
Hmm.
nowhere within our scriptures, there is nowhere within our canon, there is nowhere within our history that the concept of inerrancy has ever been brought up or espoused or defined. It's a completely foreign Protestant idea that has no place within our doctrine. It simply, as far as we are concerned, does not exist as a concept. When defending the idea of prophethood, we conflate the nature of revelation with the moral and human status. In effect, we're saying prophets aren't perfect, but revelation is. I think that's a problem for a variety of reasons, like accommodation. This idea that prophets learn and understand things through their own culture, through their presuppositions, their time. The stuff that's already in our canon should challenge simplistic views of this bright line division between man and prophet. Scripture contains letters, composite and edited letters like Second Corinthians. Doctrine and Covenants include several sections that were letters, but only parts of those letters are canonized. Is it reasonable to assume that divine revelation kicked in neatly and discreetly on this sentence and then ended precisely on that period? That man wrote this part, but then God, through his prophetic megaphone, just wrote that part? That we could go to the original typewriter and highlight the original letter and highlight the inspired parts, but the rest was just purely human? It doesn't make sense, this
Hmm.
framework for speaking as a prophet versus speaking as a man, right? Joseph Smith's feelings here from Liberty Jail move us past this simplistic construct. The things of God are of deep import and time and experience, and careful and ponderous and solemn thoughts can only find them out. Thy mind, O man, must stretch. Um, but yeah, this concept here of the prophet only acting as a prophet or acting as a man is kind of pushed back against his brother and sister as Michigan, who thought that a prophet was always a prophet. And Joseph Smith is saying, no, he's a normal guy who engages in wrestling for fun, even in his time off, right? So it's not to
Hmm.
do necessarily with inerrancy or anything to do with the concept. And we have this false idea around how this should be used. So I don't think the author of this Sydney email is interpreting that statement very well. I don't disagree that Brigham Young was just completely wrong and what he said was uninspired in every sense of the word. He was just straight up wrong, and that came from his racist context. And personally, I think that Protestant Americans need to do more to take responsibility for the fact that they perpetuated these myths that dark-colored skin was an indication of divine disfavor, the curse of Cain. This is not a uniquely Mormon idea. It did not originate within Mormonism. Um, but, racism happened in the past.
Yeah,
It's
no,
a
I feel like I
huge
need to
tragedy.
clarify. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah, no, go
I
for
feel
it.
like I need to clarify what I said. Just to be clear, racism is bad. The priesthood ban was a mistake. I do think that Brigham Young's comments on that specific occasion can be viewed with just a little bit more nuance. And I think that there is an interpretation of his comments that is technically correct. I don't know whether it was necessarily inspired, but I think
Sure.
that you can be. I think that it's possible to read those comments and be charitable enough and say that what he was saying isn't technically wrong. That's all that I was trying to say. I don't
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to
yeah,
make it
no.
sound like
Gotcha,
I'm
no.
trying to justify racism. Not trying to make it sound like I want to justify the priesthood ban or anything like that. So I just want to make sure
No, you're
that's
good.
it's absolutely clear what I'm trying to get across
I
here.
think I just zoned out for a second when you were talking and I missed
Now
something.
you're
But yeah.
good.
Tithing. In 1907, President Joseph F. Smith taught that the church expects to see the day when they will no longer require any tithing from us, as they will have sufficient to run the church. Wouldn't that be great? Our church now makes more in interest from its prudent investments every year than it needs to run the church. For those that are struggling in difficulties, consider Lorenzo Snow's comments. I plead with you in the name of the Lord. I pray that every man and woman and child who has the means shall pay 1/10 of their income as a tithing. Don't disagree with anything here, really. Um,
Yeah,
I
really the only
disagree
thing
that
is
the church is in a position where we are able to pay for everything that we want to do. We are here trying to establish the millennial reign of the Savior on the earth, and we will not rest until the entire world is covered in temples and meeting houses, especially in parts of the world where the church is developing very quickly, in less financially privileged parts of the world, in the South. Uh, that is going to take a lot of money. That is going to take a lot of resources. We are only just now seeing the uptick on missionary work down there. And there's a great fair talk from a year or two ago. We'll put it in the notes and whenever we post this, going over the data. And I think if I remember correctly, it's a finance professor at BYU who goes through and shows if the church were to significantly increase their charitable donations, they would be in the red so fast. They are actually giving about as much as they can. Anti-Mormons have got to stop getting mad about the fact that the church isn't giving enough. We are not at the day where we are done doing the Lord's work on the earth yet.
Hmm.
Well, hopefully we'll get there. I hope Lorenzo Snow's about right about that. We are not there yet. We are not even close. We're just seeing the beginnings of the restoration. And President Nelson is reaffirming this over and over again. He's probably aware of this statement, or at least aware of this sentiment, and he is affirming we haven't even seen the greatest demonstrations and manifestations of the Lord's power yet. It's just getting crazy. So yeah, I don't
Uh,
necessarily disagree with anything he said there. Zach,
could you read that quote again of the I think
sure.
the prophet's quote?
Zach,
Um,
you're cutting out a little bit.
Promise quote. Yeah. Church expects to see the day when they will no longer require any tithing from us, as they will have sufficient to run the church.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to confirm that's what it said. I think an important note here, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit, is kind of what's the purpose of the church? I think it's kind of tied to polygamy as well. Maybe I should bring this up to another issue. Either way, I think an important principle to remember is that it doesn't really need our money. Like, because people bring that, it's like, why does God even need your money? It's like, that's a good question. He doesn't need our money, but he needs our sacrifice. I think there's that one scripture that says, um, wow, I can't, sorry, I lost it. I have a
No, I
huge
get what
brain
you're getting
fart
at.
there,
Yeah,
but
for sure.
either way, yeah, God doesn't need, yeah, he doesn't need our money. He needs our sacrifice. He wants to
Yeah.
make us better people, more like him, more willing, not so focused on money, but willing to give it up. So in a sense, you could say the church is never, its needs are never going to be fed or met until we give tithing. Then it's like, okay, you're doing great. So I don't know. It's kind of I don't think I phrased it very well, but that's my thought process.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a there's an amazing talk given by a non-member at BYU. I don't remember if it was a devotional or simply a article that was written at some point. Um, I'll put it in the notes at some point, but this is one that I read my freshman year, and it's incredible because he talks about the psychological impacts of giving and charity, and just goes through and shows that contrary to all common sense and reason, people who give more end up being richer. They end up being happier. They end up performing better at their jobs. They end up getting that promotion they want. They end up richer. We have data to indicate this. It's an amazing article as he talks about just giving money selflessly, not because you're forced to, but because you want to. Donating to your
Mhm.
fast offerings, donating to people in need, donating to build temples because you have faith in the Lord, even though you don't always know everything. It's going to make you happier. It's probably going to make you richer. Cool
Yep,
stuff.
just like
He's not a
Jesus said.
member. Yeah.
Just like
Okay.
Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than receive.
Oh yeah. Look at that. Anachronisms. Okay, David, this is your time to shine. You wrote most of what we have in the doc about anachronisms here.
Yeah, sure. Well, anachronisms. So first off, it just says, I am sure that we are all aware now that the Book of Mormon has a troubling number of anachronisms in it. There is a large amounts of texts and ideas from multiple documents, all published between 400 AD and 1830, that have been found in the Book of Mormon, and sadly, most of them cannot be argued away.
Valid.
So the first problem with this is the word troubling. I do not find the amount of anachronisms troubling. the general trend for anachronisms is when Joseph Smith first published the Book of Mormon in 1830. There were a few anachronisms that were pointed out pretty quickly, but then over the next 100 years or so, there were a bunch of anachronisms pointed out, and only a few like ticked off the list. But within the past 100 years after that, all up to today, a huge number of anachronisms have been completely disproved and demonstrated. I think it's close to over 80% of all of the anachronisms raised against the Book of Mormon have been demonstrated to not be anachronisms. And it gets better and better every single year. Just recently, I think it was a few months ago, one of the anachronisms was honeybees. And what do you know? They found honeybees recently. And so this is a thing where, yes, there are still anachronisms left. Um, there are multiple reasons for that. It could be lone shifting of words. For example, if you remember that famous meme of that little girl who's like, look at all those chickens, right? Well, she's using what's in her vocabulary to describe an animal, which is that is not the animal, right? So this is an example. There's historical attestation of this happening a lot, especially in translation. So that's a potential thing, right? Other than that, just be patient and wait. Our current here in 2024 today, it looks much, much better than when, for example, Joseph Smith was alive or Brigham Young. And so it's just a thing where for the remaining anachronisms, we're just going to have to put it on faith and it's going to keep looking better and better. And so our kids will have it better than us and so on and so forth. And someday there will be a day where there are no more anachronisms. So, yeah.
Do
Anything
we
else
want to
you
go
want to
through
Absolutely.
the
add?
list?
Can I actually pull up a resource real quick? I'm so
While you're
sorry.
doing that,
Yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna say, I think a very common tactic of anti is just to put an imaginary time limit on you, make you think this has to be taken care of right away. But something that's helped me in my studies. Well, actually, I should share my favorite scripture. I'm actually gonna reverse what it says because I think it's a bit more spiritually fulfilling that way. But this would be First Nephi chapter 11, verse 17, where he says, "I do not know the meaning of all things. Nevertheless, I know that God loveth His children." I love that verse because despite all of the evidences, we've been going at this for almost 2 hours now. There's a ton of evidence for the church, ton of answers and responses. But even then, we don't know everything. Um, but one thing that helps me is I like to think back to the early members of the church. Think of all these criticisms we've gone over, and think about how the first saints in the 1800s did not have any of these answers, and they remained faithful despite it. And to me, that's a great witness of their faith and the faith that we can all have if we just have a little more patience, a little more faith in God that in the end He will make all things right.
Yeah. I was gonna pull up this list here. Sadly, I only happen to have it quickly accessible in Spanish, but it was presented in FAIR a few years ago. And the idea is the guy goes through and shows all of the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon in 1965, like all the flora, the fauna, the state of linguistics, the names, writings, cultural elements in antiquity, everything. And all of the red ones are the ones that in 1965 they had no evidence for these things, nothing at all whatsoever. So if you're a member in 1965, it's really hard to believe, right? Like you're staring down all these anachronisms and you're like, dang, this is not looking good, you know? Fast forward to 2019. I wish I had a more updated version. This is the same list of anachronisms. You'll have to take my name for it because it's my word for it because it's in Spanish, but same exact list of anachronisms. Look how many have been solved. Most of these are in
Mhm.
the green now. We have evidence for these. We have a better understanding of how these were possible. We have a better and more complete understanding of how these could have occurred. Some of them are still blue, which means they're kind of we're starting to see evidence, but it's not the academic consensus yet. Like secular scholars wouldn't yet accept the things that Mormon apologists are kind of seeking out. So the guy who put this together was very conservative with how he did it. He was like, I don't want to overstate our case, you know? So the blue ones are the one he's like, look, there might be evidence. We're starting to uncover stuff like horses, right? But it's not 100% solid yet. This is caballos en la época del Libro de Mormón, horses during the time of the Book of Mormon. And he's like, we're getting there. We're moving towards that. We're tending towards evidence. They keep pushing the date of horses closer and closer to the time of the Book of Mormon, but I'm not going to make a definitive statement yet. So it's a lot easier to believe in the Book of Mormon now than it was in 1965 during Hugh Nibley's era, as crazy as that sounds, right? Is the point that I want to make in showing these two tables side by side. Um, and that's, yeah, the point that y'all were making as well. I just really like pulling up those tables and pointing out it's actually easier to believe now.
Yeah, and I believe the most up-to-date list was published by Mormonar.
Mhm.
Definitely
Yes.
check out their website. And that, I know if you don't have access to that as, on your mission phones, go visit it like on a, family history computer or something, or just ask one of us, and we'll be more than happy to give you the current state of any anachronisms that you're curious about. Or if you've heard any from your friends or investigators, let us know, and we'll see if it is or it is not. So, yeah,
I think there's a drive floating around with PDFs of all the Mormon articles. So
Mhm.
perfect.
sort of do a search in the group for that. But yeah, that kind of covers up this entire one. He tries to insinuate that church leaders now are backing off on the claim that it's history. They're not. They're just pointing out it's not a textbook of history. It's not a history textbook, which it's not. It's religious history, right? Which is very different. And this is just pointing out the thing about genre within the scriptures. When we read the Bible, we know that some of the books were written as poetry. We shouldn't expect to read them as history. We know that some of the epistles were written as just that. They were written as letters, right? So we're not expecting to read the comics section in a newspaper and look for information about what stocks we should buy is a comparison that we can use, right? So there's absolutely religious elements in the Book of Mormon. I would argue there's probably etiological elements, etiologies, stuff like that going on. I don't think that any of the apostles are backing off on historicity um, in the slightest. Any
Yeah, if you look
comments
at just
about
for example,
apostles?
just like the first quote where President Nelson says that the Book of Mormon is not a textbook of history. It is not a record of all former inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere. That is absolutely true. It is about the people of Nephi. They were not the only people on the American continent at the time of their settling. And it is also not a textbook of history, right? Those didn't even exist until like the 1800s. And then the second quote, too, is from Suarez. He says that it was not translated the traditional way that scholars would translate ancient texts by learning ancient language. Uh, yes, obviously, right? Because the book was written in Reformed Egyptian. There was no academic, literature, even on just normal Egyptian during Joseph Smith's lifetime. So what other way for him to translate rather than through the gifted power of God? So all these things, they're just not saying what this person wants them to say.
Yeah. Did you want to talk about New Testament real quick?
Sure, yeah, that'll be super quick. The email persons, they state that the Book of Mormon also quotes from many New Testament verses, which of course could not have been found on the brass plates. The author is correct. The text of the New Testament could not have been found on the brass plates. Smart people can come to entirely different conclusions on this. For example, the author of this email clearly sees this fact as evidence of the Book of Mormon's 19th century fabrication. On the other hand, many numerous faithful members of the church who have known this for a long time have advanced numerous explanations. In fact, there is nobody that knows the intertextuality of the Book of Mormon better than believing scholars. The notion that this fact somehow automatically requires you to reject the Book of Mormon as ancient scripture is just false, right? Without this assumption, all this tells us is that Joseph Smith used King James Version language, which was massively popular in his time and place. And I think one example, Brent Gardner, he gives a great discussion on how he translated the Book of Mormon in this book right here, Gift and Power, Translating the Book of Mormon. Definitely pick up a copy and read it. I cited it in a
Best
recent post.
commentary.
It's
Best
really,
commentary on the Book of Mormon.
really good. Yeah, Ben Specker recommends it. It's amazing. And so he posits the process of translation is taken in two parts of the Book of Mormon. One is there's a meaning on the brass plates that can be said and given and translated properly in English, right? And the second part is Joseph's intimate familiarity with the King James Jacobean revival language, especially of the New Testament, right, is what he would read all the time. Um, those texts would be primed kind of in his mind. He used it in his everyday speech, right? And so he just had all these familiar phrases, words, combinations of words, phrases, sentences, and verses too. Um, and those verses, those phrases were available and appropriate to the meaning Joseph understood, and therefore became the way the plate text meaning was expressed in the English translation. And this priming for Joseph Smith would have happened subconsciously. We do it as well. It's just how the brain works. Um, that's just due to our context, and for Joseph Smith and his King James Version language, that was due to his context. Additionally, another point too is it's not anachronism to have, New Testament teachings or verses in the Book of Mormon if it was given by revelation from God to prophets and apostles. So, I mean,
Mhm.
another point again is literally just God just told Moroni or told Nephi or gave him the same revelations that he gave to Peter or Paul later. So,
If I could jump in, I think you might be giving them just a little bit too much credit. I don't think we need to go through all the examples here, but just go into the first example. You can, if you read the two verses side by side, you can see that they have similar ideas, but they aren't actually quoting each other. So, like, I'm gonna read Romans 3:20, and that in the King James version is, "Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight, for by the law is the knowledge of sin." Now, then I'm gonna read Second Nephi 2:5. And men are instructed sufficiently that they know good from evil. And the law is given unto men, and by the law no flesh is justified, or by the law men are cut off. Yea, by the temporal law they were cut off, and also by the spiritual law they perish from that which is good and become miserable forever. Now you can see that they are generally talking about similar ideas here, but there's no actual, copying here. There's no actual quoting. There is no quote here. It's not even similar enough to call it a quote. There's like half a sentence that has kind of similar phrasing, but it's not even an exact um it's not even exactly the same. It's just kind of similar ideas. And if you really believe that God inspired the Old Testament, the New Testament, any of these other books, it shouldn't be that big of a stretch to imagine that he inspired another prophet to say something kind of similar. I mean, the prophets of the Bible talk about similar ideas and use similar words to describe the same concepts all the time. And I mean, sometimes it is intentionally quoting. They do quote each other sometimes, but other times it's just not a quote. They're just talking about something pretty similar.
yep. And
Good
if you want a
stuff.
good full discussion for each one of these New Testament allusions or quotations, Brant Gardner's Second Witness commentary goes through each one of these and then asks, is this like a plausible, like, is there like an Old Testament sort of like feel or like sort of belief system or doctrine that could be translated into this sort of account, or is it just Joseph Smith's language? And so just definitely look that up. So.
Nick Frederick as well here at BYU is the expert on intertextuality. Joseph Spencer as well has done a lot of great work on Deutero-Isaiah specifically. Joshua Sears has a book coming out soon on Deutero-Isaiah. I found it really funny, the very specific dates that they have here, published between 400 AD and 1830.
I mean,
The
those
the
were the
the
times when
dates
the
they
goalposts were in the ground, more or less.
the dates here they give kind of almost we're only sharing this within the cavalry, so I don't mind saying this. Like this kind of excludes the Deutero-Isaiah, which is another really big, commonly pointed out anachronism that how did they have access to these Deutero-Isaiah verses? So I don't know if the author of this Sydney email just doesn't know about the Deutero-Isaiah issues and clearly doesn't know about the apologetic responses also given, but they kind of intentionally put in these dates that make it clear they don't seem to know about those issues. So I'm just, this is not very well written, guys. The person writing this email does not know much about the scholarship here.
Well, can I
And
say something even funnier about that?
yeah,
So he said there's multiple documents all published between 400 AD and 1830. All of the things that he cites are in the Bible. The
maybe
Bible
he
was
meant to
written,
see
the Bible was written
BC.
prior to 400 AD. Like, dude, have you read your own stuff here? Like,
You're
my
right. He
gosh,
must
this
have
is
meant BC.
like clearly whoever wrote this did not proofread it. I'm sorry, but
I think I'll give that one to him. He probably meant BC. But even then, you exclude the Deutero-Isaiah writings written in
well, no,
like 500 BC.
I think he did mean 400 AD because that's more or less when the Book of Mormon was written by Mormon and Moroni and eventually, put into the ground. I think that
True.
he actually did mean to
You think
write
that's what he was
400
getting
AD.
at?
That's
Very
that's
true.
my guess anyway. Short of
Yeah.
having him here to explain, I think that is what he's
Long term short, this
getting
is
at
long
here.
story short, this is a mess.
Yeah, yeah,
DNA evidence. We're gonna go through this so quick. It's getting late out here.
yes.
Um, this is one again that we have faithful scholars who have done so much work on this topic. Ugo Perdigo has published a ridiculous amount of content. Perdigo is an actual geneticist, not just like a family history enthusiast. He does more math than any of us can actually imagine, going through all the genetics, both of the Book of Mormon and of Joseph Smith's descendants. The author of the Sydney email actually cites him a few times in those footnotes. So I hope he doesn't mind me citing Ugo Perdigo, who is a faithful, active member who believes in Book of Mormon historicity.
Mhm.
I'm not going to read this actually. I just changed my mind. Point is, there's lots of good stuff out there. We'll link it. Perdigo makes the case that we should not expect to see a tiny bit of DNA, given all of the factors like population drift and everything going on at the time when we have such a small sample of literally just Lehi, Mulek, and yeah, we shouldn't expect this. And he gives the example of the DNA they recovered of a Paleo Eskimo individual in Greenland, and this new data suggests that their entire model about uh, intercontinental travel was completely wrong, and that there was a migration before the earliest one that they had speculated about beforehand, just because we found this new DNA. We had no evidence of this group coming over from Greenland beforehand, or coming
Mhm.
to Greenland, or however it is beforehand, right? But there's this entire group that just got missed because we didn't have the DNA evidence. So it's not ridiculous to state that a group could, like the Book of Mormon, like the inhabitants of the Book of Mormon, could also be
Mhm.
overlooked, especially when it's coming from such a small, limited gene pool, is the point that he's going to make. So yeah, I think the scholarship is on our side on this one,
Mhm.
given all
Definitely.
of these factors like um, genetic drift, population bias, and everything. Uh, we don't have much of a problem here. That's all I'm going to say. Anyone else want to add anything on DNA evidence?
Nope. We got three arguments left, and
Okay,
I think we should just speed it through them.
speed through them.
I'm ready
DNC
to.
89. This is not a problem for anyone who knows church history.
Yep.
Brigham Young, he says it's common knowledge, of course, that Joseph and Brigham were known to drink and sell alcohol. If it's common knowledge, I'm not sure why he feels like he has to secretly send out an email to his entire stake about it.
Hmm.
But again, yeah, line upon line revelation. It wasn't until the early 1920s, 1921 or 1926, if I remember right, that they took wine out of the sacrament cups and standardized on the word of wisdom as a very hardcore line, right? Up to that
Hmm.
point, it was a very gradual process of uh, dropping all of these things more slowly. You can find lots of great quotes from Brigham Young saying, like, look, if the old ladies want to get away with a cup of tea, if the old fogies want to get away with their tobacco, it's all right. It's not the end of the world, you know.
Hmm.
So this was again a gradual thing, and if
I
you
mean,
believe in line upon line revelation, if you believe that President Nelson has the authority to update the word of wisdom and give a better guidance for our generation, for us in 2021, as they do, as they routinely do. This is brand
mhm,
new within the last few years that, oh, hey, you also can't vape, by the way, right? Section 89 says nothing about vaping. So the people who have a problem with this are fundamentalists who want to try and point out a contradiction between scripture and what the church says now, when that's not how our church works. That only really, those supposed contradictions really only work if you're coming at this with a Protestant mindset of inerrancy and infallibility and not ongoing revelation and continued guidance by inspired prophets.
mhm. Yeah, I mean, the Lord isn't going to
Yeah.
ask people to quit alcohol cold turkey. Like they had to build up a culture first around not drinking really strong stuff like whiskey before they could, completely wean themselves off of alcohol. I mean, the Lord is reasonable. It's legitimately hard to quit drinking. It's
Anyone who's been on a
something that
mission
a lot
knows
of
that
people
you have
struggle
to
with.
work with your investigators on this over time.
Exactly.
Quitting smoking, you make him a
Mhm.
calendar, it takes a second.
Exactly.
Sometimes you get a miracle kid who's able to just drop it.
Hmm.
But that's not everyone, and the Lord is considerate of that. Endowment, really quick, masonry. I wish we had our good friend on here. But again, this is another one. This is adaptation,
Hmm.
which everyone in the cavalry should know about. Ben Spackman has written so much about this. The idea that Joseph Smith can adapt principles from Masonry, and not even principles, mostly just elements, right? He's able to use symbols that are found in Masonry and repurpose them to teach a completely different lesson, right?
Mhm.
Within Masonry, their version of these ordinances and ceremonies looks is much more telling the story of a mason, a stoneworker working on Solomon's temple, right?
Mhm.
And teaching these ethical, moral principles for self-improvement. Our story is about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and our growth to become like God as we
Yeah.
progress through kingdoms,
Yeah, as an
right?
allegory for salvation. Yeah.
Yes, and exaltation. So there might be some overlap with symbols, but this is kind of one of those weird things about symbols is that symbols only mean what the user wants them to mean.
Hmm.
If I use an upside down star and I say, to me, this represents the 5 points of being a good BYU student, that's what it means to me. You
I mean,
know,
it
it
used to
doesn't mean
represent
I'm
the wounds of Christ.
it
Like
doesn't mean I'm
that's
secretly a
legitimate.
Satanist, you know? It doesn't mean that I'm secretly worshiping the devil. It's not going to be like I get to the pearly gates and God was like, "Oh, sorry, you were accidentally worshiping Satan. You didn't know it, but you were doing it all along, you know?" So, symbols only mean what we want them to mean, and we're not using them to mean what the Masons wanted them to mean for most part. There are some elements of the endowment that were just straight carried over from Masonry, some of those handshakes, some of those hugs that they used to do, but again, we're fine with adaptation. This, again, 95% of this comes down to how do you understand Revelation? Are you okay with adaptation? Are you okay with prophets using elements from their culture? Right.
Yeah, this is a consistent pattern, like even throughout the Bible as well. A lot of people don't realize, but many
Mm,
of Old Testament practices are borrowed from their ancient Near Eastern neighbors, the neighbors of the Israelites, many centuries, thousands of years before the Israelites even practiced them. For example, circumcision was an ancient pagan fertility ritual that was taken by God and the Israelites, adapted, attached a covenant to it, and then gave more symbolism and was just practiced, right?
great
Similarly,
stuff.
same thing with animal sacrifices, temples, a ton of other things in the Old Testament. Similarly,
Absolutely.
there's Freemasonry, there's cool things in there, there's great symbolism, great teaching value in there. We take that, God changes it, and then attaches a covenant to it. There you go. Should be
Mhm.
no problem.
One of my favorites is Psalm 29, which was originally composed as a Canaanite hymn worshiping the storm god Baal. That was its original purpose. It was a completely, apostate pagan hymn worshiping Baal, right? And Israelites later repurposed it. They took elements from this and adapted it and turned it into a Hebrew Psalter, right? Worshiping
Mhm.
Yahweh instead. But it still has a lot of the same elements of storms and lightning and thunder, right? It still has this same imagery. And the Israelites are able to just kind of readapt that for their own purposes.
Mhm.
So, anyone who understands how Revelation worked for these ancient Israelites and where they're getting these elements from should not be concerned about Joseph Smith using elements of his culture, unless you're some sort of crazy conspiracy theorists who thinks that, Starbucks cups accidentally cause people to worship Satan or something like that.
Yeah.
So, next up, second anointing. I don't
This is
want to
the
get too
last
much
one.
into depth in this. We don't want to get too much into depth in this. Just not interested. One of the big misconceptions about this, oh no, you saw my secrets. I just wanted this one page from Mormoner on the second anointing, which goes through and shows big misconception here. You should all read this article. The misconception being that um, does the second anointing guarantee exaltation? No, probably not. Joseph Smith
Yeah.
and the other church leaders at the time taught that these blessings were conditional, depending on your faithfulness. Um, Orson Pratt taught that being sealed unto eternal life would guarantee exaltation, but that's a different phrase, right? Sealed up unto eternal life is affiliated with the second anointing, but it's not a name used for that ordinance. It's maybe part of that ordinance. We're not entirely sure how it was used in 1839, how it was understood back then. Um, but yeah, so we have a lot of primary sources. Mormoner will go through all of them here. Um, their footnotes are great.
Hmm.
This is what high quality footnotes looks like, in case you were wondering. George Q. Cannon explained that the blessings of the second anointing would only be effective in the next life, provided the recipients were faithful and fulfilled their part of the covenant. There is no doubt about it. Joseph Hovey understood that his exaltation was conditional. He wrote that he prayed daily that he would continue to hold out until the end, right? Joseph Smith as well taught similar principles. We have Joseph Smith stated that nothing can prevent any individual against committing the unpardonable sin, this sin against the Holy Ghost. Nothing can prevent you from doing that. You're always at risk of falling susceptible to that. So that's just one of those big misconceptions that it seems like even modern people who have received the second anointing apostate and then later apostatized seem to misunderstand. Joseph Smith did not understand this to guarantee exaltation, and the sources that we have do not indicate that it does.
Yeah, no, we teach that we are meant to endure to the end. And I think it's really interesting that he said, it is for those who have done enough already in this life and are therefore granted eternal exaltation now. Quite frankly, the only people who've done enough already are the people who are dead. And I think the fact that it's reserved for stake presidents and mission presidents and above, those are some of the busiest callings in the church. Like, I don't know if you realize just how much a stake president has to do on a daily basis, but if this were meant for people who had done enough, they would probably give it to somebody who had less work to do. Let's just say that.
Sure. Okay,
Yeah.
that's it. Sorry this took so long. I didn't expect, I was hoping we could get through this in like an hour, but
Yeah,
this
no
was
worries.
fun. I did enjoy this.
Yeah, no, it was
Um,
a lot of fun. I
Word
liked it.
Radio made a very quick response to this, and they kind of just made fun of the format that it was presented in and didn't really get into any of the arguments.
Mhm.
Obviously, none of the arguments are particularly great in the first place in this particular
Yeah.
case. This is low level. Like, there's good, high quality anti-Mormonism out there. You can go
Mhm.
read like Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalf and find interesting and new and compelling and uh, thought-provoking claims being made against the church. Even
Mhm.
back in its day, some of the Gerald and Sandra Tanner stuff, now it's mostly been debunked just because it's been around for so long. But back in its day, that was big. Or you can read some of the big atheists out there, right? This is not it. So
Mhm.
we're just doing this because we thought it would be fun. We had some time to kill, a little bit too much time to kill, and hopefully we will be moving on to some bigger and better targets sometime soon. But yeah, any closing words?
If you have
Uh,
any questions that were not like answered to your satisfaction here, reach out to us in the comment section, ask scholars in the cavalry, post it so that everyone else can see. Because Aldar, if you have that question, other people have that question. Um, do your reading, of course, and then always check the sources. Don't believe anyone.
Connor?
I think I don't really have much to say other than I don't think that this is going to really shake anybody's testimony. But on the off chance that there is someone whose first interaction with apologetics is this letter, I am happy that we're able to hopefully provide you with a little bit more information, something that you can use to hopefully use this as a springboard to learn more about these topics. Because even though we did spend a little bit more time than we hoped, we have only scratched the surface of all of these topics. This is a really, really big subject to talk about. And yeah, I just hope that we can be a resource for you guys to hopefully learn more about these topics and become better equipped to, tell people exactly why you believe and respond to critics.
Yeah. Our purpose was the author of this clearly thinks that these topics should cause people to doubt that, as he says, this is messiness. These are difficult topics, and most of
Mm-hmm.
them shouldn't be. They shouldn't cause anyone to doubt unless you're looking at them from a presentist Protestant lens. If you understand church history, none of these should be remotely problematic. And from the wording, it's very clear that they are disaffected. They use a lot of those anti-Mormon key phrases, those
Buzzword.
hmm?
Buzzwords.
The buzzwords, yeah, is the word I was looking for. Those anti-Mormon buzzwords, that they bring up instead of calling it a seer stone, calling it a rock in a hat to kind of diminish its importance, stuff like that. So, uh, hopefully, this doesn't affect anyone's testimony in
Mm-hmm.
the slightest because it shouldn't. think that's all we got to say. Thanks for sticking
Yep.
with us, guys. Have a great night.
Yep. You have a good one.